When Omega Maid Amélie arrives to tame the Alpha's wild children, she never expects to heal the broken Alpha's wounded heart, or that their forbidden love will spark a revolution that reshapes supernatural society forever. From servants' quarters to revolution's throne, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is show a grieving predator that even apex wolves need someone brave enough to love them without fear. And how this would end, no one would ever expect. Chapter 1: The Haunted Alpha. The scream shattered the pre-dawn silence like claws through silk. Rafael Blackthorne jolted awake in his massive four-poster bed, his alpha senses immediately identifying the source. Luna. Again. Because his 9-year-old daughter's nightmares had become as regular as the sunrise, echoing through Moonhaven Estate's stone corridors with bone-chilling frequency. After rolling from the bed with predatory grace, he pulled on dark pants and moved toward the door. Next, he stopped himself, hand frozen on the ornate handle as memories crashed over him like a tidal wave of grief. From there, his mind conjured Isabella's gentle voice. "Go to her, my love. She needs her papa's comfort." Soon after that phantom whisper faded, reality reasserted itself with brutal clarity. What followed was the crushing knowledge that he had no idea how to comfort anyone anymore. Still, the screaming continued, now joined by his son Marcus's angry roars. Yet Raphael remained paralyzed in his doorway, watching servants scurry past like mice avoiding a predator's den. Even so, something deep in his chest pulled toward that suffering, the same instinct that had once made him a protector rather than a destroyer. Despite that urge, he turned away from the children's wing and stalked toward his study instead. To make things worse, his reflection caught in the hallway mirror showed him exactly what he'd become. Not only were his golden eyes ringed with exhaustion, but the 3 jagged scars running from temple to jaw served as permanent reminders of his greatest failure. More importantly, the servant's fearful glances told him everything he needed to know about the monster he'd become since Isabella's death. Moments later, he reached his study and slammed the door behind him. By the time the sound stopped echoing, the children's cries had finally ceased, probably because some terrified maid had fled their room entirely. Eventually, Raphael knew he should go to them and should try to be the father they needed. That night, like every other night, he chose the cowardice of solitude instead. Come morning, he would prowl these halls again, avoiding the broken pieces of his family while pretending strength he no longer possessed. Chapter 2: When Monsters Raise Monsters. The antique vase exploded against the nursery wall like a crystal grenade. Standing in the doorway of what had once been a cheerful playroom, Raphael surveyed the destruction with a mixture of rage and helpless despair. Because his children had transformed the space into a battlefield, and their latest victim lay scattered in expensive shards across Persian rugs. After taking in the scene of devastation, his gaze fixed on the perpetrators. Next, 9-year-old Marcus crouched atop an overturned bookshelf, his small fingers partially shifted into claws that could rend steel. From there, Raphael's attention moved to 11-year-old Luna, whose empathic abilities currently projected waves of pure fury that made every servant within 50 yards nauseous. Soon after meeting her defiant golden eyes, so much like his own, he felt the familiar stab of self-loathing. What followed was a tense standoff between Alpha Father and Alpha children who'd inherited his power, but none of his control. Still, Marcus bared tiny fangs in a warning growl that would have been adorable if it wasn't so genuinely threatening. Yet Raphael found himself admiring their ferocity even as it destroyed everything around them. Even so, he couldn't ignore the fear lurking beneath their aggression, the desperate need for a parent who'd emotionally abandoned them. "Where is Maid Whitmore?" Raphael's voice carried the authority of Alpha's, though it felt hollow in his chest. To make things worse, Mrs. Blackwood's response came in stammering fragments. She left in the night, Your Grace. Said the children were possessed by demons and she feared for her immortal soul. Not only had they lost another caregiver, but they'd also traumatized another human in the process. More importantly, Rafael realized he felt more pride than shame at his children's effectiveness in driving away unwanted intruders. Moments later, Marcus leaped from the bookshelf with supernatural agility, landing in a predatory crouch. By the time Rafael processed the movement, his son had shifted back to human form and was glaring with barely contained hostility. Eventually, Rafael would understand that this moment represented everything wrong with their family dynamic. Children forced to raise themselves while their father drowned in grief. That night, he stood there feeling like a stranger in his own home, watching cubs who'd learned to survive without their pack leader. Come morning, Mrs. Blackwood would announce that yet another maid had answered their advertisement, though Rafael doubted this one would last any longer than the previous 11. Send word that we'll interview her tomorrow, Rafael said, turning away from the destruction. Rather than face his children's pain, he chose retreat once again, because confronting their needs meant confronting his own failures. Meanwhile, Luna's empathic projection shifted from rage to something that felt like abandonment, and Rafael forced himself to keep walking despite the way it tore at his chest. Next, he heard Marcus whisper to his sister, "Don't worry, Luna. We'll make this one leave too." From there, Rafael's steps faltered as he realized his children weren't just acting out. They were protecting themselves from further abandonment the only way they knew how. Chapter 3. The Omega Who Didn't Run. The carriage wheels crunched over frost-covered gravel with the finality of a death knell. Watching from his study window, Rafael observed the modest conveyance approach Moonhaven Estate through morning mist that clung to the Gothic towers like ghostly fingers. Because this maid, number 12 in 18 months, had arrived with the same false hope as all the others. After the carriage stopped at the main entrance, a figure emerged that made Rafael's enhanced vision sharpen with predatory focus. Next, he caught her scent on the wind, Omega, but not the usual submissive fragrance that made his wolf pace with dominance. From there, his analysis continued as the woman straightened her worn traveling dress and lifted her chin to study the imposing facade. Soon after she began walking toward the entrance, Rafael noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. What followed was a moment of genuine surprise as she looked directly up at his window and didn't look away. Still, most Omegas would have dropped their gaze immediately when meeting an alpha's stare, especially one with his reputation for savagery. Yet this woman held his gaze with steady gray eyes that seemed to see straight through stone walls to the broken man hiding behind them. Even so, Rafael felt his wolf stir with interest rather than the usual indifference toward Omega staff. Despite her obvious exhaustion from travel, she radiated a quiet strength that spoke of survival against difficult odds. To make things worse for his carefully maintained emotional distance, something about her bearing reminded him of Isabella's courage. Not only did she refuse to be intimidated by the estate's forbidding appearance, but she also seemed to be assessing it rather than fleeing from it. More importantly, her lack of fear suggested either exceptional bravery or dangerous naivety. Moments later, she disappeared from view as Mrs. Blackwood opened the massive oak doors. By the time Rafael lost sight of her, something unfamiliar had stirred in his chest, curiosity. Eventually, he would recognize this moment as the beginning of everything changing, though he couldn't have known it then. That night, he found himself wondering what color her eyes were up close, and whether they would still hold that same fearless determination. Come morning, he expected to find her gone like all the others, another casualty of his children's protective warfare. Rather than retreat to his usual emotional bunker, Rafael made a decision that surprised him. Meanwhile, his wolf seemed more alert than it had been in months, responding to something in the Omega's scent that spoke of strength rather than submission. Next, he straightened his cravat and prepared to meet the woman who'd looked at his fortress and seen something worth entering. From there, he walked toward the main hall, unaware that his life was about to change forever, because Amélie Laurent had not come to Moonhaven Estate to be another fleeing maid. Soon after reaching the entrance hall, Rafael heard her voice for the first time, melodic but firm, speaking to Mrs. Blackwood with respectful authority that no Omega should possess in the presence of alphas. What followed was the realization that this maid might actually be different from the others. Still, Rafael told himself it was mere curiosity that drew him toward the sound of her voice. Yet his wolf knew better, recognizing something in her scent that promised either salvation or destruction, and finding both possibilities equally compelling. Chapter 4. First Blood. The crystal decanter shattered against the wall exactly where Amélie's head had been moments before. Standing in the doorway of the morning room, Rafael watched his potential 12th maid dodge flying crystal with grace that spoke of experience surviving dangerous situations. Because Marcus had launched his opening attack within minutes of their introduction, and the Omega was still standing. After the initial assault, Rafael expected to see fear or outrage in those steady gray eyes. Next, he prepared to dismiss another failed candidate and begin the search for number 13. From there, something unprecedented happened that made his wolf pace with agitated interest. Soon after, Marcus shifted partially and snarled with genuine menace. Amélie did something no maid had ever attempted. What followed defied every rule Rafael understood about alpha-omega dynamics. Still, instead of submitting or fleeing, she stepped toward the aggressive child with calm determination. Yet what shocked Rafael most was her scent. No fear, no submission, just steady resolve that made his enhanced senses reel with confusion. Even so, she moved like someone who'd faced down alphas before and emerged unbroken. "Marcus." Her voice carried gentle authority that cut through his snarls like warm honey. "That was an excellent throw. Your aim is quite impressive." Despite the praise seeming insane given the circumstances, Rafael watched his son's aggressive posture falter with bewilderment. To make things worse for his understanding of Omega behavior, she crouched to meet Marcus at eye level, a position that screamed vulnerability. Not only was she making herself physically defensible, but she was also speaking to his son like an equal rather than a superior addressing a subordinate. More importantly, Marcus's partially shifted claws were retracting despite his obvious confusion. Moments later, Luna emerged from behind an overturned chair where she'd been projecting waves of hostility. By the time she stepped into view, her empathic abilities had shifted to something that felt like curiosity. Eventually, Rafael would recognize this as the moment his children encountered someone who saw past their weapons to their wounds. That night, he stood frozen in the doorway, watching his feral cubs respond to gentleness they'd forgotten existed. Come morning, he would understand that Amélie Laurent possessed something more dangerous than any alpha strength, the ability to see truth beneath facades. "Why aren't you running?" Marcus asked, his child's voice cracking with vulnerability he tried to hide behind aggression. Rather than answer immediately, Amélie studied both children with those penetrating gray eyes. Meanwhile, Rafael found himself holding his breath, waiting for her response. Next, she spoke words that hit him like physical blows. "Because running away from pain doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes you lonelier." From there, the morning room fell into a silence so profound that Rafael could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Soon after her words settled over them all, Luna took a tentative step forward. The first time she'd approached a stranger voluntarily since Isabella's death. What followed was Rafael's realization that this Omega might actually be more dangerous than he'd imagined, because she was reaching his children in ways he'd forgotten how to attempt. Chapter 5. The Impossible Woman. Your children aren't wild. They're grieving. The words hit Rafael like claws to the chest, stealing his breath and making his wolf snarl with defensive fury. Because this Omega maid had just diagnosed his family's dysfunction with casual accuracy that cut straight to the bone. After she spoke those devastating words, Rafael felt his carefully constructed walls of denial crumble with terrifying speed. Next, he struggled to maintain his composure while everything inside him roared against her unwelcome insight. From there, he watched Amélie settle cross-legged on the floor between his children, completely ignoring the destruction surrounding them. Soon after she positioned herself in that vulnerable pose, both Marcus and Luna moved closer, drawn to her calm presence like moths to flame. What followed was perhaps the most shocking sight Rafael had witnessed since Isabella's death. Still, his feral children, who'd driven away 11 maids through pure terror, were sitting peacefully beside an Omega they'd known for less than an hour. Yet what made his chest tighten with inexplicable emotion was the way Luna's empathic projections had shifted from hostility to something that felt almost like hope? Even so, Rafael couldn't process how this stranger had accomplished what he'd failed to do for 18 months. "They miss their mother," Amélie continued, her voice gentle but firm. "And they're angry at the world for taking her away." Despite wanting to roar at her presumption, Rafael found himself mesmerized by the accuracy of her assessment. To make things worse, she was speaking truths he'd been too cowardly to acknowledge. Not only was she reading his children's pain with supernatural precision, but she was also making them feel understood rather than judged. More importantly, they were responding to her Omega nature not as weakness, but as strength. Moments later, Marcus did something that made Raphael's knees nearly buckle. By the time the boy finished speaking, Raphael's worldview had shifted on its axis. "Papa won't play with us anymore," Marcus whispered, his young voice breaking. "He looks at us like we make him sad." Eventually, Raphael would understand that his children had been protecting him from their pain just as desperately as he'd been avoiding theirs. That night, standing in that destroyed morning room, he felt the full weight of his failures as a father. Come morning, he would be forced to confront the truth that an Omega stranger understood his family better than he did. Rather than flee or make excuses, Amélie turned those penetrating gray eyes directly on Raphael. Meanwhile, his wolf paced with agitation at being seen so clearly by someone who should have cowered before his alpha presence. Next, she spoke words that would haunt him for days. "They're not acting out for attention, Your Grace. They're testing whether anyone will stay long enough to love them." From there, the accusation in her tone became unmistakable, though she delivered it with devastating gentleness. Soon after she finished speaking, Raphael realized that this Omega had just challenged him more directly than any Alpha had dared in years. What followed was the terrifying recognition that she might actually be right about everything. Still, his pride demanded he defend himself against her accurate diagnosis. Yet when he opened his mouth to deliver a crushing set-down, Luna's small voice stopped him cold. "Will you stay?" his daughter whispered to Amélie. "Please don't leave like all the others." Even so, Raphael watched this stranger, this impossible Omega, take his child's hand with infinite tenderness. "I'll stay as long as you need me to," she promised. Despite every instinct screaming that she was dangerous to his emotional survival, Raphael found himself hoping she meant those words. Chapter 6. When Walls Crumble. "You're afraid of them." Amelie's quiet observation hit Raphael like a silver bullet to the chest, making his wolf howl with rage at being seen through so completely. Because she'd just voiced the secret shame he'd carried for 18 months, that his own children terrified him more than any enemy he'd faced. After delivering that devastating truth, she turned those impossibly perceptive gray eyes on him with something that looked almost like compassion. Next, Raphael felt his carefully constructed mask of alpha authority begin to crack under her steady gaze. From there, the morning room seemed to shrink around them as she continued speaking with gentle ruthlessness. Soon after she began her psychological dissection, Raphael realized he was trapped between fight and flight responses. "You're afraid that loving them means accepting she's really gone," Amélie continued, her voice soft but implacable. What followed was the most accurate character assassination Raphael had ever endured. Still, he wanted to shift and snarl, to use his alpha presence to cow this presumptuous Omega into submission. Yet something about her scent told his wolf that aggression would only prove her point about his cowardice. Even so, the children were watching this exchange with wide eyes, sensing the tension crackling between the adults. Despite his fury, Rafael couldn't ignore how they looked to Amélie for protection rather than him. "You don't know anything about my family," Rafael growled, his voice carrying enough menace to make lesser beings flee in terror. To make things worse, Amélie didn't even flinch at his display of dominance. Not only did she hold her ground, but she also tilted her head with what looked suspiciously like pity. More importantly, she was treating him like a wounded animal rather than an apex predator, and somehow that felt more insulting than any challenge to his authority. Moments later, she did something that made his breath catch in his throat. By the time she finished moving, Rafael's understanding of Omega behavior had been completely overturned. Eventually, he would recognize this as the moment his emotional walls began their final collapse. That night, her words would echo in his dreams with haunting accuracy. Come morning, he would be forced to confront truths he'd spent 18 months avoiding. "I know you love them desperately," Amélie said, rising from her position between the children. Rather than retreat from his obvious fury, she stepped closer with fearless determination. Meanwhile, Rafael found himself backing away from her approach, the alphas of Blackthorne retreating from an Omega maid. Next, shame flooded through him at his own cowardice. From there, she continued her gentle assault on his defenses. "I know you blame yourself for not protecting her, and I know you think staying away from them keeps them safe from more loss." Soon after she spoke those words, Rafael felt something break open in his chest, a dam of grief he'd been holding back since Isabella's death. What followed was the horrifying realization that this Omega could see straight through to his broken soul. Still, he fought against the truth of her words with every fiber of his being. Yet when Luna's small hand slipped into Amélie's with perfect trust, Rafael understood that his children had found in this stranger what he'd failed to give them: safety without fear, love without abandonment. Even so, accepting her help meant admitting his failures as both father and alpha. Despite the logical part of his mind recognizing her wisdom, his pride roared against such vulnerability. "They need their father," Amélie said quietly, her gray eyes holding him with unwavering compassion. "And you need to forgive yourself for being unable to save everyone." Without warning, Marcus spoke the words that shattered Rafael's last defense. "We don't want you to go away too, Papa." As the silence stretched between them, Rafael finally understood that his children's wildness had been their way of expressing the same fear that paralyzed him: terror of losing everyone they loved. Her voice trembled with gentle conviction when Amélie spoke her final truth. "Healing doesn't dishonor her memory, Your Grace. It honors it." The space between them burned with recognition as Rafael realized this Omega had just offered him something more dangerous than any weapon: hope for redemption he didn't deserve. Chapter 7. Learning to Trust. The breakfast table felt like a battlefield disguised as domestic tranquility. Sitting across from Amélie while his children ate their porridge without throwing it, Rafael struggled with the strange sensation of watching his family behave like a family. Because in just 3 days she'd accomplished what seemed impossible: bringing peace to Moonhaven Estate. After witnessing Marcus politely ask for more jam instead of demanding it, Rafael felt his worldview continuing its seismic shift. Next, Luna actually smiled, genuinely smiled, while sharing a story about the birds outside her window. From there, Rafael's gaze moved to Amélie, who listened to his daughter's chatter with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. Soon after Luna finished her tale, the Omega responded with thoughtful questions that made the child glow with importance. What followed was Rafael's reluctant admission that this woman possessed gifts that went far beyond simple Omega nurturing instincts. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that accepting her help meant surrendering something fundamental about his alpha nature. Yet watching his children thrive under her care forced him to question everything he believed about strength and weakness. Even so, his wolf paced with confusion at being grateful to someone he should dominate. "Papa," Marcus said suddenly, "Miss Amélie says you used to tell stories about brave knights. Will you tell us one?" Despite the innocent request hitting him like a physical blow, Rafael saw hope flickering in both his children's eyes. To make things worse, Amélie was watching him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to strip away all his defenses. Not only did his children want his attention, but they also still believed he might have something worthwhile to offer them. More importantly, Amélie's slight nod encouraged him to try, to risk being the father he'd once been. Moments later, Rafael found himself fumbling for words he hadn't spoken in 2 years. By the time he began the tale of Sir Galahad and the Dragon of Despair, his voice had steadied with growing confidence. Eventually, he would recognize this as the moment he chose healing over hiding. That night, he would fall asleep to the sound of his children's laughter echoing through halls that had known only silence for too long. Come morning, he would wake with something he'd thought lost forever: purpose beyond mere survival. The dragon breathed shadows instead of fire, Rafael continued, watching his children lean forward with rapt attention. Rather than the theatrical voice he'd once used, his tone carried genuine emotion that made the story feel real. Meanwhile, Amélie's encouraging smile gave him strength to continue weaving magic with words he'd forgotten he possessed. Next, she began asking questions that drew the children deeper into the tale. From there, something shifted in the room's atmosphere as Rafael realized they were creating a memory together, all 4 of them participating in something beautiful and fragile. Soon after finishing the story, Luna clapped her hands with delight, while Marcus immediately began planning his own dragon-slaying adventure. What followed was the first genuinely happy moment Rafael had experienced since Isabella's death. Still, the weight of Amélie's gaze reminded him that this progress came with expectations he wasn't sure he could meet, yet her presence somehow made him want to become the man his children needed. Even so, old fears whispered that this happiness was temporary, that he would inevitably disappoint everyone who dared to trust him again. "Will you tell us another story tonight, Papa?" Luna asked, her golden eyes bright with anticipation. Despite the terror of making promises he might not keep, Rafael heard himself saying, "Of course, little star. Every night, if you wish." The space between them filled with tentative hope as his children exchanged glances that spoke of dreams they'd thought impossible. Chapter 8. The Healer's Touch. "You're hurt." Amélie's quiet observation made Rafael freeze in the doorway of his study, his hand instinctively moving to cover the fresh bandage beneath his shirt. Because he'd forgotten that Omega senses could detect blood even when carefully hidden. After she turned from organizing his scattered papers, her gray eyes immediately fixed on the dark stain seeping through white linen. Next, her expression shifted to something between concern and exasperation that made his wolf whine with unexpected submission. From there, she crossed the room with purposeful strides that brooked no argument. Soon after reaching him, she began rolling up her sleeves with the efficiency of someone accustomed to tending wounds. What followed was Rafael's instinctive retreat from her approaching hands. Still, something in her scent, pure Omega healing energy, made his injured shoulder throb with sudden awareness of how much it actually hurt. Yet when she reached for his shirt buttons, his alpha pride roared against such vulnerability. Even so, the pain radiating down his arm suggested he needed help, whether he wanted to admit it or not. "I'm fine," Rafael said through gritted teeth, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his words. Despite his protest, Amélie fixed him with a look that could have melted steel. To make things worse, she radiated the kind of maternal authority that made even alphas want to confess their transgressions. Not only was she unimpressed by his stoic facade, but she also seemed to see straight through to the exhausted man beneath the alpha's mask. More importantly, her healing instincts were responding to his pain with increasing urgency. Moments later, she spoke words that shattered his resistance. "Your children need you alive and healthy, Your Grace. Let me help." By the time her fingers touched his bare shoulder, Rafael's breath caught at the immediate relief that flooded through him. Eventually, he would understand that Omega healing magic operated on levels deeper than simple medicine. That night, he would dream of gentle hands soothing away more than physical wounds. Come morning, he would wake with the knowledge that Amélie Laurent had seen him at his most vulnerable and hadn't fled in disgust. "How did this happen?" she asked, her touch impossibly gentle as she peeled away blood-soaked bandages. Rather than lie, Rafael found himself telling the truth. Territorial dispute with the Thornton pack. They thought my grief made me weak. Meanwhile, golden light began emanating from her palms as her Omega abilities responded to his injury. Next, warmth spread through his shoulder like liquid sunshine, easing pain he'd been carrying for days. From there, Rafael watched in fascination as torn flesh began knitting together under her ministrations. Soon after the healing magic took hold, he felt something else. A strange sense of peace that had nothing to do with physical relief. What followed was perhaps the most intimate moment Rafael had shared with anyone since Isabella's death. Still, this wasn't sexual intimacy but something deeper. The profound vulnerability of allowing someone to care for him. Yet as Amélie worked, her proximity filled his senses with her unique scent, Omega comfort tinged with something that made his wolf pace with growing interest. Even so, he tried to maintain emotional distance while she literally held his life in her hands. Despite his best efforts, something fundamental was shifting between them. "There," she whispered, her voice soft with exertion as the last of his wounds sealed. "Try to be more careful, Your Grace. Your children have lost enough." Without warning, her words hit him with unexpected force. Not criticism, but gentle concern that spoke of genuine care. As the silence stretched between them, Rafael felt the weight of her touch lingering on his skin long after she'd stepped away. The space between them hummed with something indefinable. Gratitude, awareness, and the dangerous possibility of connection neither of them dared acknowledge. Chapter 9. When Demons Come Calling. The howl split the midnight air like a blade through silk. Rafael bolted upright in his bed, his alpha senses immediately identifying the sound. Not one of his children's nightmares, but something far more dangerous prowling the estate grounds. Because that howl carried the signature of rogues, the exiled wolves who lived outside pack law and survived by preying on the vulnerable. After throwing on clothes with supernatural speed, he grabbed silver-lined weapons from his hidden armory. Next, his enhanced hearing picked up multiple sets of paws moving through the forest that bordered Moonhaven's eastern boundary. From there, his mind raced through tactical assessments while his wolf demanded immediate action to protect their territory. Soon after detecting at least 6 distinct scents, Rafael realized this wasn't a random incursion. Someone had sent these rogues specifically to test his defenses. What followed was his immediate sprint toward the children's wing, because rogues preferred young alpha blood to anything else. Still, when he reached Luna's room, he found it empty, her window thrown open and curtains billowing in the night breeze. Yet instead of panic, a cold fury settled over Rafael like armor forged from 18 months of suppressed rage. Even so, Marcus's terrified scream from somewhere outside made his blood turn to molten silver. "Papa!" The cry came from the garden maze where Isabella used to walk with the children on summer evenings. Despite every instinct screaming at him to charge blindly toward his son's voice, Rafael forced himself to think strategically. To make things worse, he could smell Amelie's scent trail leading in the same direction. She'd gone after the children alone. Not only was his Omega maid facing down rogues without backup, but she was also protecting cubs that weren't even hers by blood. More importantly, the bond he'd been denying suddenly blazed to life as her terror flooded through their emerging connection. Moments later, Rafael shifted partially and raced through the estate grounds with predatory grace that would have made his ancestors proud. By the time he reached the maze entrance, the sounds of battle echoed through the carefully trimmed hedgerows. Eventually, he would understand that this night marked his full transformation from broken widower to protective alpha. That night, he would choose to fight not just for his children, but for the Omega who'd risked everything to save them. Come morning, the supernatural world would know that Rafael Blackthorne had found something worth killing for again. Rather than charge blindly into the maze, Rafael used his enhanced senses to map the positions of enemies and allies. Meanwhile, Luna's empathic projections painted a picture of absolute terror mixed with fierce determination that could only come from Amélie. Next, he heard his Omega's voice cutting through the night. "Stay behind me, both of you. Don't look at their eyes." From there, Raphael's wolf roared with approval at her protective instincts while simultaneously demanding he reach her immediately. Soon after identifying the exact location of the confrontation, he began moving through the maze with lethal purpose. What followed was the sound of silver meeting claws as Amélie defended his children with weapons she shouldn't have known how to use. Still, her scent carried more than fear. It carried the same deadly determination that had once made Isabella legendary. "You picked the wrong cubs, rogue." Raphael heard her snarl with authority that made his alpha nature sing with recognition. Yet when a pained cry escaped her lips, something inside Raphael shattered completely. Even so, the sound of his children sobbing spurred him to move faster through the maze's twisting passages. "Amélie!" Marcus's voice carried pure terror. "There's too many of them." Despite the hopelessness in his son's tone, Raphael caught something else: absolute faith that their maid would protect them no matter the cost. The space between one heartbeat and the next, Raphael burst into the maze's center to find a sight that would haunt his dreams with pride rather than nightmares. Amélie stood over his fallen children like an avenging angel, silver blade in one hand and Omega magic blazing from the other, holding off 4 rogues who'd underestimated what a protective Omega could become. Chapter 10: Blood and Silver. The scent of silver and rage painted the night air crimson. Stepping into the maze's heart, Raphael felt something primal and forgotten roar to life in his chest, the protective fury of an alpha whose pack was threatened. Because the sight of Amélie bleeding while defending his children triggered instincts that had been dormant since Isabella's death. After assessing the tactical situation in milliseconds, he realized why the rogues had chosen tonight for their attack. Next, his enhanced vision cataloged their positions while his wolf demanded immediate violence against anything that dared threaten his family. From there, Raphael's partial shift completed with bone-deep satisfaction he hadn't felt in 18 months. Soon after his claws extended and fangs descended, the rogues finally understood they'd walked into a trap of their own making. What followed was a display of alpha dominance that reminded every supernatural within miles why the Blackthorne name had once been whispered with reverence and terror. Still, Raphael fought not for territory or pride, but for the Omega who'd risked everything to protect what mattered most to him. Yet even in the midst of battle fury, part of his mind cataloged the impossible. Amélie moving with combat skills no maid should possess, wielding silver weapons with deadly precision. Even so, her primary focus remained on shielding his children rather than pressing any attack. "Papa!" Luna's empathic projection flooded him with relief so profound it nearly staggered him. Despite the chaos surrounding them, Raphael caught the scent that made his blood freeze. More rogues approaching from 3 directions. To make things worse, these weren't random exiles but organized hunters with military precision. Not only were they facing a coordinated assault, but the attack pattern suggested inside knowledge of Moonhaven's defenses. More importantly, someone had planned this strike specifically to exploit his emotional isolation. Moments later, the first rogue lunged at Raphael with silver-tipped claws that could have ended a lesser alpha. By the time he finished tearing the creature's throat out, 3 more had taken its place. Eventually, he would understand that this battle marked his complete transformation from grief-paralyzed widower to the protector his family needed. That night, he fought not just for survival, but for the future Amélie had shown him was possible. Come morning, the supernatural community would whisper about the night the alphas of Blackthorne remembered what it meant to have something worth protecting. Rather than fight defensively, Raphael began systematically hunting each rogue with methodical precision. Meanwhile, Amélie continued her own battle, moving to keep the children safely behind her while engaging enemies with skill that defied explanation. Next, he caught her scent changing, Omega magic flaring as she called upon abilities that went far beyond simple healing. From there, golden light erupted from her hands with force that sent rogues flying into maze walls. Soon after witnessing her unleash power he'd never imagined an Omega could possess, Rafael understood that Amélie Laurent was far more than she'd appeared. Despite his questions about her true nature, gratitude overwhelmed suspicion. What followed was the most perfectly coordinated battle of his life, as they moved in synchronization that spoke of deeper connection than conscious planning. Still, the bond between them pulsed with shared determination and something that felt dangerously close to... "Behind you!" Amélie's warning came just as claws whistled through the air where Raphael's head had been. Yet her voice carried more than concern. It carried the authority of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations. Even so, she never stopped positioning herself between the children and any threat. "How many more?" Raphael snarled as he dispatched another rogue with efficient brutality. Despite her exhaustion, Amélie's response came without hesitation. "Two approaching from the north entrance, one circling to cut off our retreat." The tactical awareness in her voice made Raphael's estimation of her shift dramatically. Not only was she handling combat with professional competence, but she was also tracking multiple threats while protecting non-combatants. Without warning, Marcus's terrified scream cut through the night as the largest rogue yet appeared at the maze's entrance. In that moment, Raphael faced a choice that would define everything: pursue the immediate threat or trust Amélie to handle what was behind them. "I've got them." Amélie's voice carried absolute certainty despite blood streaming down her arm. "Go." Despite every protective instinct screaming against leaving his children with anyone else, Raphael found himself trusting this extraordinary Omega completely. To make things worse, the massive rogue charging toward Marcus carried scars that marked him as a pack leader, far more dangerous than the scouts they'd faced. Not only was this the real threat they'd been preparing for, but his children's survival depended on Raphael choosing to work with Amélie rather than trying to protect everyone alone. More importantly, something in her scent told him she was far more capable than any maid should be. Moments later, Raphael launched himself at the pack leader with fury that had been building for 18 months. By the time they collided in a tangle of claws and fangs, the entire maze shook with the force of their impact. Eventually, he would understand that this fight represented more than protecting his family. It was his choice to finally trust someone else with what mattered most to him. That night, Amélie would prove herself worthy of that trust in ways that redefined everything he thought he knew about Omega capabilities. Come morning, they would both be forever changed by what they'd survived together. Rather than the quick victory Raphael expected, the rogue leader proved to be a formidable opponent with combat experience that matched his own. Meanwhile, the sounds of Amélie's continued battle reminded him that she was facing multiple enemies while protecting two frightened children. Next, claws raked across his ribs as the rogue pressed his advantage, clearly expecting grief to have weakened the once legendary alpha. From there, Raphael felt something he'd forgotten existed: the satisfaction of proving his enemies wrong about his capabilities. Soon after drawing first blood, he began systematically dismantling his opponent with techniques that had once made other alphas avoid challenging the Blackthorne territory. Despite 18 months of emotional numbness, his combat instincts remained sharp as polished silver. What followed was a brutal demonstration of why Raphael had once been considered one of the most dangerous alphas in the supernatural hierarchy. Still, he fought not for dominance or territory, but for the right to build the future Amélie had shown him was possible. "Is that all you've got?" The rogue snarled, though his breathing suggested otherwise. "No wonder your mate died. Couldn't protect her either." Yet instead of the devastating rage such words should have triggered, Raphael felt only cold determination. Even so, the mention of Isabella's death reminded him that grief had nearly destroyed everything worth protecting. "You're right," Raphael said quietly, circling his wounded opponent. "I failed her, but I won't fail them." Despite the rogue's obvious surprise at this response, Raphael continued his methodical assault. Because tonight wasn't about proving he was strong enough to prevent every loss, it was about being strong enough to protect what remained. The space between one heartbeat and the next, Raphael's claws found the rogue's throat with surgical precision. What followed was the silence that marked the end of immediate threats, broken only by his children's sobbing relief. Without another word, he turned toward where Amélie stood swaying on her feet, blood loss finally taking its toll despite her victorious expression. Chapter 11. After the Storm. The taste of victory mixed with copper and moonlight on Raphael's tongue. Standing in the maze's center, surrounded by fallen rogues, he watched Amélie finally lower her silver blade with shaking hands that told the story of her exhaustion. Because whatever training had taught her to fight like a warrior, it hadn't prepared her for the aftermath of genuine battle. After scanning the area for remaining threats, Raphael's attention fixed on his children, physically unharmed but emotionally shattered by the night's violence. Next, Luna's empathic abilities projected confusion and terror that made his chest ache with paternal guilt. From there, he realized that surviving the attack was only the beginning of dealing with its consequences. Soon after Marcus began crying in earnest, Raphael understood that his children would need more than physical protection to recover from this trauma. What followed was his first genuine test as a father since Isabella's death, comforting frightened cubs while processing his own adrenaline crash. Still, something had fundamentally changed in how he approached their pain. Yet, when Amélie swayed dangerously, her adrenaline finally failing, Raphael caught her before she could fall. Even so, the feel of her blood soaking through his shirt reminded him how close he'd come to losing her too. "The children," she whispered, even while barely conscious. "Are they safe?" Despite her obvious need for immediate medical attention, her first concern remained his children's welfare. To make things worse, this selfless dedication made something in his chest crack open with dangerous warmth. Not only had she risked her life for cubs that weren't hers, but she was also maintaining that protective instinct, even while bleeding from multiple wounds. More importantly, his wolf recognized something in her scent that spoke of pack loyalty stronger than blood ties. Moments later, Luna's small voice cut through his racing thoughts. By the time she finished speaking, Raphael's understanding of his daughter's perceptive abilities had expanded dramatically. "Miss Amélie loves us, doesn't she, Papa?" Luna asked, with the devastating directness only children possessed. "I can feel it. She really loves us." Eventually, he would recognize this as the moment his children claimed Amélie as family rather than merely staff. That night, everything would change in ways that made their bond unbreakable by law or custom. Come morning, he would be forced to confront feelings he'd been denying since the moment she'd looked up at his window without fear. Rather than answer Luna's question directly, Raphael gathered his daughter in his free arm while supporting Amélie with the other. Meanwhile, Marcus pressed close to his side, seeking the comfort he'd been denied for 18 months. Next, Raphael began the careful journey back to the castle, hyper-aware of every sound that might signal additional threats. From there, his mind raced between tactical concerns and the growing realization that tonight had changed everything between him and his Omega maid. Soon after reaching the castle's safety, Mrs. Blackwood appeared with a flock of servants who took one look at the blood and began efficient emergency protocols. Despite their quick response, Raphael refused to let anyone else tend Amélie's wounds. "I'll handle her care myself," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Because something about seeing her bleed for his children had triggered possessive instincts he'd thought died with Isabella. What followed was an hour of careful wound cleaning and healing magic application while his children watched from the doorway. Still, Amélie remained unconscious, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion and blood loss. "Will she be okay?" Marcus asked, his young voice cracking with worry that made Raphael's protective instincts surge. Yet answering that question required Raphael to admit something he'd been fighting since the night of her arrival. Even so, looking at his children's frightened faces, he found the courage to speak the truth he'd been denying. "She'll be fine," Raphael said quietly. "Miss Amélie is stronger than she looks. She's very special to all of us." Despite the careful wording, his children heard what he wasn't quite ready to say aloud, because children always understood emotional truth better than adults wanted to admit. "You love her too," Luna said with satisfaction that suggested she'd been waiting for this admission. "Good. We need her to stay forever." The space between them filled with understanding, as Rafael finally acknowledged what his heart had known since that first breakfast, when she'd made his children smile. Not only did he care for Amélie Laurent, but he was also falling in love with her strength, her courage, and her infinite capacity for protecting what mattered. As the silence stretched around them, Rafael felt something he'd thought lost forever: hope for a future that included more than just survival. Chapter 12. The Council's Judgment. The supernatural council's arrival came with the dawn like vultures sensing carrion. Watching 3 official carriages roll through his gates while Amélie still lay unconscious upstairs, Rafael felt his newfound peace shatter like crystal under pressure. Because council investigations into rogue attacks always carried political implications that went far beyond simple security concerns. After identifying Lord Thornton among the arriving dignitaries, Raphael's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Next, his enhanced senses detected the subtle sense of satisfaction and anticipation that suggested this visit had been planned long before last night's attack. From there, his tactical mind began processing the implications while his wolf paced with aggressive anxiety. Soon after the council members emerged with expressions of false concern, Rafael understood that the rogue attack had been a prelude to something far more dangerous. What followed was his immediate concern for Amélie and the children's safety in the face of political predators who would exploit any weakness. Still, he couldn't afford to show the depth of his attachment to his Omega maid without giving his enemies ammunition. Yet the timing felt too convenient. Rogues testing his defenses followed immediately by council scrutiny of his leadership capabilities. Even so, Rafael forced his expression into the mask of ducal authority that had served him before Isabella's death. "Lord Thornton, councillors." Rafael's voice carried perfect composure, despite the fury building in his chest. "Rather early for a social call, isn't it?" Despite wanting to refuse them entry, Rafael understood that denying the council would create more problems than facing their questions. To make things worse, Luna's empathic abilities would detect the predatory intentions radiating from these unwelcome guests. Not only did he need to protect his family from whatever accusations were coming, but he also had to shield Amélie from council attention while she remained vulnerable. More importantly, any sign of emotional attachment to his maid could be used to question his judgment as a territorial leader. Moments later, Lord Thornton's smile sharpened into something predatory as he studied the evidence of the recent battle. By the time he began speaking, Rafael knew this confrontation would determine his family's future. Eventually, he would recognize this moment as the test of everything Amélie had taught him about true strength. That night, he would choose between old patterns of dominance and new understanding of what leadership really meant. Come morning, the council's decision would either validate his transformation or destroy everything he'd fought to rebuild. "We received rather disturbing reports about last night's excitement," Thornton said, his tone suggesting the opposite of concern. Rather than immediate sympathy for the attack, his attention was fixed on cataloging potential weaknesses. Meanwhile, Councillor Blake stepped forward with documents that made Raphael's blood freeze. Next, the formal charges became clear as they began reading accusations that had obviously been prepared in advance. From there, Rafael realized that the rogue attack hadn't been random, but orchestrated to create the perfect pretext for council intervention. Soon after understanding the scope of the conspiracy, his protective instincts flared to life with lethal intensity. "Failure to maintain territorial security," Blake read with bureaucratic precision. "Inappropriate emotional attachment to staff compromising judgment. Questions about fitness for continued leadership." What followed was Raphael's growing understanding that his enemies had been watching Moonhaven Estate for weeks, documenting every sign of his recovery as evidence of weakness. Still, he couldn't regret the healing Amélie had brought to his family. "Where is this maid who allegedly defended your children?" Thornton asked with false curiosity. "We'd very much like to meet the Omega who accomplished what your security forces could not." Yet the predatory gleam in his eyes suggested motives that had nothing to do with gratitude or recognition. Even so, Rafael felt his wolf surge with protective fury at the implied threat to Amélie. "Miss Laurent is recovering from injuries sustained protecting my family," Rafael said carefully. "Perhaps when she's feeling stronger." Despite his diplomatic response, Rafael could smell the satisfaction rolling off the council members. Because they'd found exactly what they'd come looking for: evidence of attachment that could be used against him. The space between them crackled with unspoken threats as Rafael realized his enemies were prepared to use Amélie as leverage to control or destroy him. Without another word, he made a choice that would define everything. "Gentlemen, I believe we need to discuss this matter privately." As the tension roared around them, filled with political implications and personal stakes, Rafael prepared to fight the most important battle of his life. Not with claws and fangs, but with words that would determine whether love was stronger than law. Hired to tame the Alpha's wild children. Chapter 13. The Predator's Circle. "Miss Laurent, I presume?" Lord Thornton's voice carried the silky menace of a predator who'd found his prey, making Raphael's wolf snarl with protective fury. Because the way this Alpha's eyes fixed on Amélie, who'd insisted on coming downstairs despite her injuries, spoke of intentions that had nothing to do with official council business. After the formal introduction, Raphael watched Amélie curtsy with perfect composure, despite the obvious pain each movement caused her. Next, his children pressed closer to her sides, their alpha instincts recognizing danger, even if they didn't understand its political implications. From there, Thornton began his careful interrogation disguised as polite conversation. Soon after establishing Amélie's background and qualifications, he moved to more dangerous territory with surgical precision. "Remarkable progress with the children," Thornton observed, his tone suggesting the opposite. "One might wonder what methods you employ to achieve such dramatic results." What followed was Raphael's growing understanding that this visit was orchestrated specifically to expose and destroy whatever peace his family had found. Still, he couldn't intervene without confirming their suspicions about his attachment to the Omega maid. Yet, watching Amélie navigate these treacherous waters with quiet dignity made his chest swell with unwilling admiration. Even so, he could smell her carefully controlled fear, a scent that made his protective instincts roar for violence. "I simply treat them as children who've experienced loss, counselor," Amélie replied with steel beneath silk. "Understanding and patience work wonders." Despite her diplomatic response, Raphael caught the subtle challenge in her tone. To make things worse, so did Thornton, whose smile sharpened with anticipation like a blade finding flesh. Not only was she refusing to be intimidated, but she was also subtly defending Raphael's parenting without overstepping her position. More importantly, the children were absorbing every word of this exchange with the intensity of cubs learning to recognize threats. Moments later, Marcus did something that made Raphael's blood freeze. By the time his son finished speaking, the political landscape had shifted dramatically in favor of their enemies. Eventually, Raphael would recognize this as the moment his children chose their side in a war they didn't understand. That night, consequences would begin cascading that would threaten everything he'd started to rebuild. Come morning, the council would have ammunition they'd never possessed before. "Miss Amélie isn't like the others," Marcus declared, with the brutal honesty only children possessed. "She doesn't run away when we get angry, and she makes Papa smile again." Rather than remain silent, Luna added her own devastating testimony. "Papa was sad all the time before she came. Now he tells us stories and eats breakfast with us." Meanwhile, Raphael watched 3 council faces process this information with barely concealed satisfaction. Next, Thornton's predatory smile widened as he recognized the gift he'd just been handed. From there, the interrogation continued with surgical precision designed to expose the depth of emotional connection between Raphael and his maid. Soon after Luna finished speaking, Counselor Blake stepped forward with his own carefully crafted questions. "How fascinating," Blake murmured, his calculating gaze moving between Rafael and Amélie. "Such personal transformation suggests unusual influence for a mere employee." What followed was a series of increasingly invasive questions that pushed the boundaries of political propriety. Still, Rafael understood that objecting would only confirm their suspicions about the true nature of his relationship with Amélie. Yet when Thornton's attention fixed on Amélie with predatory intensity, something inside Rafael shifted dangerously. Even so, he forced himself to remain still, while every instinct screamed at him to protect her from their verbal assault. "Tell me, Miss Laurent," Thornton continued, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "what exactly is your methodology for reaching troubled children where so many others have failed?" Despite the innocent phrasing, Rafael heard the real question. How had an Omega maid succeeded where Alpha authority had failed? "Love, Counselor," Amélie replied simply, her gray eyes meeting Thornton's stare without flinching. Children respond to genuine affection regardless of their supernatural status. As the silence roared between them, Rafael realized that his Omega maid had just delivered the most devastating political statement possible. That love mattered more than alpha dominance in raising strong children. The space between them crackled with implications that would reshape supernatural politics if allowed to spread beyond this room. Chapter 14. The Midpoint Revelation. "You're not just a maid." Thornton's accusation hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, making Raphael's wolf pace with barely restrained fury. Because the way the council leader's eyes narrowed suggested he'd discovered something that would change everything between Raphael and the woman who'd saved his family. After that devastating observation, the room's atmosphere shifted as predators sensed weakness in their prey. Next, Counselor Blake produced documents that made Raphael's enhanced senses detect the scent of impending disaster. From there, Thornton began reading from papers that should have been impossible for the council to obtain. Soon after the first damning revelation, Raphael understood that they'd been investigating Amélie's background far longer than he'd realized. "Lady Amélie Charlotte Laurent," Thornton said with malicious satisfaction. "Daughter of the late Alphas of Ravenwood, last surviving member of a bloodline that was supposed to have died out 20 years ago." What followed was Raphael's world tilting on its axis, as everything he thought he knew about his Omega maid crumbled into dust. Still, the betrayal cut deeper than political deception. It was the shattering of trust he'd thought unbreakable. Yet when he looked at Amélie's face, he saw not guilt, but resigned acceptance that spoke of secrets carried too long. Even so, the pain in her gray eyes suggested this revelation hurt her as much as it destroyed him. "Impossible," Raphael said, though his enhanced senses were already confirming the truth. To make things worse, the children were watching this exchange with confusion that would soon transform into questions he couldn't answer. Not only had Amélie been lying about her identity, but she'd also been concealing noble blood that made her his political equal rather than his employee. More importantly, the Ravenwood bloodline carried implications that could destroy or elevate his own standing, depending on how this knowledge was used. Moments later, Thornton continued his systematic destruction of everything Raphael had believed. By the time he finished explaining the political ramifications, the future looked far more dangerous than any rogue attack. Eventually, Raphael would understand that this moment represented the true test of everything Amélie had taught him about love, transcending social barriers. That night, he would face a choice between political safety and emotional truth. Come morning, the supernatural world would know whether the Alphas of Blackthorne was strong enough to choose love over law. The Ravenwood estate was confiscated after the rebellion, Blake added with bureaucratic precision. Lady Amélie has been living under false identity to avoid political persecution for her family's mistakes. Rather than defend herself, Amélie lifted her chin with dignity that spoke of generations of noble breeding. Meanwhile, Rafael felt his understanding of her courage expand dramatically. She'd risked everything to help his family, despite knowing discovery would destroy her carefully constructed new life. Next, Thornton delivered the killing blow. Of course, harboring a political fugitive, even unknowingly, raises serious questions about your Grace's judgment and loyalty to the current supernatural order. From there, the trap's true nature became clear as Rafael realized they intended to use Amélie's deception as leverage to control his territory. Soon after processing the political implications, his wolf demanded he choose between protecting his position and protecting the woman who'd saved his children. What followed was perhaps the most important decision of Rafael's life as he weighed political survival against personal truth. Still, looking at his children's confused faces, he knew what kind of man he wanted to be for them. "You're right," Rafael said quietly, his voice carrying dangerous calm. "I've been harboring Lady Amélie under false pretenses." Yet instead of capitulation, his tone carried the authority of someone about to shift the entire game. Even so, Thornton's satisfied smile suggested he'd missed the significance of Rafael's careful word choice. "Which is why," Rafael continued, "I'm formally requesting the Council's permission to court Lady Amélie with intentions of marriage." Despite the gasps from every council member, Rafael's gaze never left Amélie's face, because he needed to see her reaction more than he cared about political consequences. The space between them burned with recognition as she understood that he was choosing her over everything else: position, security, even the safe future he'd been rebuilding for his children. Without another word, the political landscape transformed as Rafael declared war on everyone who thought love should bow to law. Chapter 15. The Choice. "Have you lost your mind completely?" Thornton's outraged question echoed through the study like a death knell, but Rafael felt only calm certainty as he watched Amélie's eyes fill with tears that might have been joy or despair. Because the choice he'd just made would either save them all or destroy everything he'd fought to rebuild. After that moment of stunned silence, the council erupted in accusations and threats that proved they'd never expected him to choose love over political convenience. Next, Rafael's enhanced hearing picked up the sounds of his children whispering in the corridor. They were listening to every word of this conversation that would determine their future. From there, the true scope of the trap became clear as Thornton began outlining consequences designed to force Rafael into submission. Soon after understanding that his enemies had planned for every contingency except genuine courage, Rafael felt something he'd forgotten since Isabella's death: absolute certainty about what mattered most. What followed was Rafael's systematic dismantling of every threat the council thought they could use against him. Still, the most dangerous part wasn't defending his choice, but convincing Amélie that he meant every word. Yet when she stepped forward with dignity that spoke of noble breeding finally acknowledged, something in her scent changed. Even so, the fear remained, not of the council's threats, but of hoping for happiness she'd thought impossible. "Your Grace?" Amélie said quietly, her voice carrying controlled emotion that made his wolf whine with recognition. "You don't understand what you're offering. My family's crimes—" Despite wanting to silence her with reassurance, Rafael let her speak because she needed to voice the fears that had shaped her deception. To make things worse, the children chose that moment to burst into the room with questions that demanded honest answers. Not only were Marcus and Luna about to learn that their beloved maid was actually a lady of noble birth, but they would also discover that their father's choice might cost them everything they'd regained. More importantly, their reaction would influence whether Amélie believed she deserved the love being offered. Moments later, Luna's empathic abilities filled the room with emotions too complex for a child to fully understand. By the time she began projecting confusion and hope in equal measure, every adult present felt the weight of decisions that would echo through generations. Eventually, Rafael would recognize this as the moment his family chose truth over safety. That night, they would discover whether love was strong enough to survive political consequences. Come morning, the supernatural world would either celebrate or condemn the alphas who'd chosen an Omega fugitive over political expedience. "Papa?" Marcus asked with the directness only children possessed. Is Miss Amélie really a lady? Does that mean she can't be our maid anymore? Rather than deflect, Rafael knelt to meet his son's eyes with honesty that cut through political complications. Meanwhile, Amélie watched this exchange with an expression that suggested she was memorizing every detail in case it was their last moment together. Next, Rafael spoke words that would be remembered long after the political crisis passed. Miss Amélie, Lady Amélie, will always be part of our family, no matter what title she carries. From there, Luna added her own devastating innocence. Good. Because we love her and she loves us. That's what families do. Soon after his daughter's declaration, Rafael saw Amélie's careful composure finally crack. Despite 18 months of hiding her true identity, she couldn't conceal her emotional response to being claimed by children who saw past noble birth to her heart. What followed was Thornton's recognition that his political leverage had evaporated in the face of genuine family bonds. Still, the council leader had one final card to play, the threat that would test whether Rafael's newfound courage could survive real consequences. Very touching, Thornton said with poisonous politeness. But the council will not recognize any union between a territorial alphas and a political traitor. Your choice, Blackthorne. Your title or your obsession. Yet instead of the capitulation he expected, Rafael smiled with anticipation that made his wolf sing with satisfaction. Even so, the next words would either establish him as a visionary leader or mark him as a fool who'd thrown away everything for love. Then I choose love, Rafael said simply. Strip my title if you must. My children need a father more than an alphas, and I need the woman who taught me how to be both. Despite gasps from every council member, Rafael's attention remained fixed on Amélie's face. Because her answer would determine whether his sacrifice meant salvation or destruction for everyone he loved. The space between them crackled with possibility as she realized that he was offering not just marriage, but partnership in building something entirely new, a life based on choice rather than obligation. Without another word, she stepped forward and took his hand with a decision that sent shockwaves through the supernatural political establishment. As the silence roared around them, broken only by their children's excited cheers, Rafael understood that they'd just declared war on a system that preferred power to love. Chapter 16, The Reckoning. The sound of Amélie's hand in his echoed like a gunshot through the political order. Standing before the stunned council with his omega, his lady, his choice, Rafael felt the weight of centuries-old traditions crumbling beneath the simple act of two people choosing each other over fear. Because what they'd just done would either inspire revolution or ensure their complete destruction. After that moment of perfect unity, chaos erupted as the council realized their carefully laid trap had become the foundation for something they'd never anticipated. Next, threats and ultimatums filled the air, while Rafael's children watched with wide eyes that absorbed every word of this conversation about love conquering law. From there, the true scope of their rebellion became clear, as Thornton began cataloging consequences designed to terrify them into submission. Soon after understanding that their enemies had planned for every scenario except genuine courage, Rafael felt his wolf settle into protective calm. What followed was perhaps the most important speech of Rafael's life, as he explained to three powerful alphas why an omega's love mattered more than their approval. Still, the real audience wasn't the council, but his children, who needed to understand that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of cost. Yet when Amélie spoke, her words carried the authority of someone who'd been raised to lead despite being forced to hide. Even so, the tremor in her voice revealed how much courage it took to claim her birthright after years of concealment. "Counselors," she said with dignity that reminded everyone of her noble heritage. "I understand your concerns about political stability, but perhaps it's time to consider whether the old ways serve the supernatural community's best interests." Despite the diplomatic phrasing, her challenge was unmistakable. To make things worse for the council's position, her argument carried the weight of observed evidence rather than theoretical politics. Not only had their unconventional household produced remarkable results, but she'd also demonstrated abilities that transcended traditional Omega limitations. More importantly, the children standing beside them represented living proof that love-based leadership created stronger outcomes than fear-based authority. Moments later, something unprecedented happened that would reshape supernatural politics for generations. By the time the first ally stepped forward, Rafael understood that their personal choice had become a catalyst for widespread change. Eventually, he would recognize this as the moment their love story became a revolution. That night, they would discover whether the supernatural world was ready for evolution or would cling to traditions that no longer served anyone. Come morning, their choice would either establish new precedents or mark them as cautionary tales about the dangers of defying established order. "If I may," a new voice interrupted from the doorway, carrying authority that made every council member stiffen with recognition. Rather than another enemy, Elder Marcus Ravencrest, the most respected supernatural leader on the continent, entered with timing that suggested careful planning. Meanwhile, Raphael felt his tactical assessment shift as the presence of someone truly neutral changed the entire dynamic. Next, even Thornton's confident posture faltered as he realized the situation had moved beyond simple political manipulation. From there, Elder Ravencrest studied the assembled group with ancient eyes that had witnessed centuries of supernatural politics. Soon after assessing every face in the room, he spoke words that would be quoted in political texts for decades. "Lord Thornton, your concerns about precedent are noted," Ravencrest said, with a voice that carried the weight of accumulated wisdom. "However, I would suggest that adaptability serves survival better than rigid adherence to outdated customs." What followed was a masterclass in political maneuvering, as the elder systematically dismantled every argument the council had prepared. Still, his most devastating observation focused on results rather than theory. "The Blackthorne children have shown remarkable improvement under Lady Amélie's guidance," Ravencrest continued. "Perhaps we should examine what produced such success, rather than condemning it for failing to match traditional expectations." Yet his support came with conditions that would test whether Raphael's commitment extended beyond romantic gestures. Even so, the terms offered a path forward that no one had thought possible. "I propose a trial period," Ravencrest announced. "1 year to demonstrate whether this unconventional arrangement benefits or harms supernatural stability. If the results prove beneficial, perhaps our laws need updating, rather than our hearts need restricting." Despite Thornton's obvious fury, he couldn't argue against the most respected elder's proposal without appearing petty. Because refusing such reasonable terms would expose the council's true motivations as political rather than protective. The space between them filled with possibility as Raphael realized they'd been offered something precious, time to prove that love was stronger than law. Without another word, he accepted terms that would either validate their choices or destroy them completely within 12 months. As the silence stretched around them, filled with the weight of cosmic change, one truth emerged. Their love story had just become the foundation for rewriting supernatural law itself. Hired to tame the Alpha's wild children. Meanwhile, Raphael felt his tactical assessment shift as the presence of someone truly neutral changed the entire dynamic. Next, even Thornton's confident posture faltered as he realized the situation had moved beyond simple political manipulation. From there, Elder Ravencrest studied the assembled group with ancient eyes that had witnessed centuries of supernatural politics. Soon after assessing every face in the room, he spoke words that would be quoted in political texts for decades. "Lord Thornton, your concerns about precedent are noted," Ravencrest said with a voice that carried the weight of accumulated wisdom. "However, I would suggest that adaptability serves survival better than rigid adherence to outdated customs." What followed was a masterclass in political maneuvering as the elder systematically dismantled every argument the council had prepared. Still, his most devastating observation focused on results rather than theory. "The Blackthorne children have shown remarkable improvement under Lady Amélie's guidance," Ravencrest continued. Perhaps we should examine what produced such success, rather than condemning it for failing to match traditional expectations. Yet his support came with conditions that would test whether Rafael's commitment extended beyond romantic gestures. Even so, the terms offered a path forward that no one had thought possible. "I propose a trial period," Ravencrest announced. "1 year to demonstrate whether this unconventional arrangement benefits or harms supernatural stability. If the results prove beneficial, perhaps our laws Niki." Chapter 17. The Point of No Return. The morning after the council's ultimatum dawned gray and unforgiving. Standing at his study window while Amélie slept off the previous day's emotional trauma, Rafael watched servants preparing the estate for what might be their final year as a unified family. Because Elder Ravencrest's 1-year trial meant every decision would be scrutinized by enemies waiting for them to fail. After processing the magnitude of what they'd committed to, Rafael felt his wolf pace with anticipation rather than anxiety. Next, his enhanced senses detected approaching footsteps that carried the distinctive rhythm of someone trying to be brave despite obvious fear. From there, he turned to find Marcus standing in the doorway with an expression that spoke of sleepless nights and questions too complex for a 9-year-old mind. Soon after their eyes met, Rafael realized his children were struggling to understand how their world had changed overnight. What followed was perhaps the most important conversation of Rafael's life, as he explained to his son why love sometimes required fighting battles that seemed impossible to win. Still, the words felt inadequate to describe the magnitude of what they were attempting. Yet when Marcus asked the question that cut to the heart of everything, Rafael felt his certainty crystallize like steel tempered in fire. Even so, the answer required honesty that might terrify a child who'd already lost too much. "Papa," Marcus said with devastating directness, "are they going to take Amélie away from us?" Despite wanting to offer false reassurance, Rafael knelt to meet his son's eyes with truth that honored the courage Marcus had inherited. To make things worse, Luna appeared in the doorway with tear-stained cheeks that suggested she'd been listening to adult conversations she couldn't fully comprehend. Not only were his children processing the revelation of Amélie's noble heritage, but they were also grappling with the knowledge that their family's happiness depended on proving something that had never been attempted before. More importantly, their faith in his ability to protect them would influence whether they could survive the year ahead. Moments later, Rafael made a choice that would define his approach to the entire trial period. By the time he finished speaking, his children understood that they weren't just fighting for their maid, but for a new way of building families based on choice rather than obligation. Eventually, he would recognize this as the moment he committed fully to revolution rather than simply personal happiness. That night, he would begin planning strategies that would either establish new precedents or ensure their spectacular failure became a cautionary tale. Come morning, the supernatural world would start watching the Blackthorne household with intensity that made every action a political statement. "They're going to try," Rafael said quietly, his voice carrying the steady authority his children needed to hear. "But they'll have to go through all of us to succeed, and we're not going to make it easy for them." Rather than elaborate on the political complexities, Rafael focused on what his children could understand and control. Meanwhile, Luna's empathic abilities projected determination that seemed far too mature for her age. Next, Amélie's footsteps approached with the careful precision of someone still recovering from both physical and emotional wounds. From there, Rafael felt his wolf settle into protective alertness as she entered the room, wearing dignity like armor despite yesterday's revelations. Soon after seeing her, both children rushed to her side with hugs that spoke of loyalty stronger than social conventions. Despite everything they'd learned about her true identity, their response remained unchanged. She was family, regardless of titles or political implications. What followed was a family meeting that would establish the foundation for everything they hoped to achieve during their trial year. Still, the conversation required acknowledging dangers that could destroy everything they'd built together. "Children," Amélie said with gentle firmness, You need to understand that this year will be different. People will be watching us, judging everything we do, looking for reasons to say our family doesn't work. Yet instead of fear, her tone carried the same determination that had made her face down rogues to protect cubs that weren't biologically hers. Even so, the weight of responsibility was evident in every carefully chosen word. "So we'll prove them wrong," Luna declared with fierce loyalty that made Rafael's chest swell with pride. "We'll show everyone that families are about love, not rules." Despite the innocence of her statement, Rafael caught the steel beneath his daughter's words, because children who'd survived the loss of one parent understood the value of chosen family better than adults who'd never faced such loss. The space between them filled with shared resolve as they committed to fighting for something unprecedented in supernatural society. Without another word, they began planning their defense against a system that preferred tradition to truth. Chapter 18. Building Something New. The transformation of Moonhaven Estate began with breakfast conversations that felt like battle plans. Sitting around the family table with documents spread between plates and coffee cups, Rafael watched Amélie organize their campaign for social acceptance with strategic precision that spoke of education he'd never suspected. Because her noble upbringing had included training in political maneuvering that most maids never received. After reviewing Elder Ravencrest's specific requirements for their trial period, the scope of their challenge became daunting. Next, every aspect of their household would need documentation to prove that unconventional leadership produced superior results. From there, Amélie began outlining initiatives that would transform their private happiness into public demonstration of alternative family structures. Soon after explaining her vision, Rafael understood that she intended to make their love story a template for others to follow. What followed was his growing admiration for the woman who'd hidden strategic brilliance behind Omega gentleness. Still, the magnitude of what she was proposing would require resources and connections that might not survive political scrutiny. Yet when she produced correspondence from sources he'd never imagined, Rafael realized that Amélie's years in hiding had been spent building networks rather than simply surviving. Even so, the risk of exposing her allies to retaliation made every alliance a potential liability. "We're not just proving that our family works," Amélie explained, her gray eyes bright with purpose that made his wolf sing with recognition. "We're demonstrating that the entire supernatural social structure needs evolution." Despite the ambitious scope of her plan, Rafael felt excitement rather than overwhelming pressure. To make things worse, the children were absorbing every word with enthusiasm that suggested they understood the historical significance of what they were attempting. Not only were they going to document their own success, but they were also going to help other unconventional families establish themselves within supernatural society. More importantly, their trial year would become the foundation for systematic change rather than isolated exception. Moments later, Mrs. Blackwood appeared with the morning correspondence that included responses to inquiries they'd sent throughout the supernatural community. By the time she finished delivering messages, it became clear that their story had already begun inspiring others to emerge from hiding. Eventually, Rafael would understand that their personal choice had catalyzed movements they'd never anticipated. That night, they would receive visitors who would expand their understanding of how many supernatural beings had been waiting for exactly this kind of leadership. Come morning, Moonhaven Estate would become the unofficial headquarters for social revolution disguised as family life. "Remarkable," Rafael murmured, studying letters from Omega healers, Beta scholars, and even Alpha leaders who'd been questioning traditional hierarchies. Rather than isolation, their defiance of convention had attracted support from unexpected quarters. Meanwhile, Marcus absorbed the political implications with intensity that suggested his alpha nature was responding to the challenge of building something unprecedented. Next, Luna began projecting excitement that infected everyone in the room with anticipation for the changes ahead. From there, Amélie outlined specific programs that would showcase alternative approaches to supernatural education, governance, and family structure. Soon after explaining her vision for quarterly gatherings that would allow other unconventional families to share experiences and strategies, Rafael felt his role expanding beyond simple participation. "You want to make this place a sanctuary," he said, understanding dawning as he processed the full scope of her ambitions. "Not just for us, but for anyone who doesn't fit traditional expectations." What followed was her confirmation that their trial year would establish precedents that extended far beyond their personal happiness. Still, the political risks of such open defiance would require careful navigation to avoid providing ammunition for their enemies. "Exactly," Amélie replied with a smile that carried both tenderness and steel. "If we're going to change supernatural society, we might as well do it properly." Yet the gleam in her eyes suggested she'd been planning this revolution long before meeting the Blackthorne family. Even so, Rafael found himself drawn to her vision of a world where difference was celebrated rather than feared. "Will other families really come here?" Marcus asked with curiosity that spoke of alpha instincts, recognizing the potential for expanded pack dynamics. Despite the complexity of the question, Amélie's response carried certainty that made Raphael's protective instincts surge with approval. The space between them filled with shared purpose as they committed to building something that had never existed before, a community based on choice rather than circumstance. Without another word, they began drafting invitations that would either establish them as visionary leaders or mark them as dangerous revolutionaries. Chapter 19. The First Test. The arrival of their first visitors came with autumn's chill and political implications that could destroy everything. Standing on Moonhaven's front steps beside Amélie while 3 carriages approached through morning mist, Rafael felt his wolf pace with protective anxiety that had nothing to do with physical threats. Because the families responding to their invitation represented the first public test of whether their vision could survive scrutiny from supernatural society. After identifying the occupants through enhanced senses, Raphael's tension increased as he recognized political refugees whose presence would either validate their sanctuary or provide enemies with ammunition. Next, his children pressed closer to his sides, their alpha instincts responding to the importance of this moment. From there, Amélie stepped forward with grace that spoke of noble training finally unleashed after years of concealment. Soon after the first carriage stopped, she began greeting their guests with authority that established Moonhaven as neutral territory, where old rules didn't apply. What followed was perhaps the most important social event in recent supernatural history, as families who'd been hiding their unconventional structures finally found a place where they could exist openly. Still, every interaction would be analyzed by observers who were already documenting evidence for future proceedings. Yet watching children from different backgrounds play together while their parents discussed shared challenges, Rafael felt something he'd never experienced before: pride in building community rather than simply protecting territory. Even so, the political ramifications of such open defiance would require constant vigilance. "Your Grace, Lady Amélie," the first guest spoke with careful formality that couldn't disguise the emotion in her voice. "I cannot express what it means to finally meet others who understand that family comes in many forms." Despite her diplomatic phrasing, Dr. Elena Voss's presence carried its own revolutionary statement. To make things worse, her work with Omega medical training had made her a target for traditionalists who believed such education threatened natural hierarchies. Not only was she the first Omega to achieve supernatural medical certification, but she'd also been raising 2 alpha children as a single parent after their beta father's death. More importantly, her success challenged every assumption about Omega capabilities that the Council used to justify their opposition to Raphael and Amélie's union. Moments later, other families began sharing their stories with openness that created bonds stronger than political alliances. By the time the informal gathering moved to the gardens, Raphael understood that they'd succeeded in creating something unprecedented, a community based on mutual support rather than competitive dominance. Eventually, he would recognize this day as the moment their personal healing transformed into social movement. That night, they would receive word that their gathering had been observed by council agents who were already preparing reports. Come morning, the supernatural world would know that the Blackthorne experiment was attracting followers willing to risk everything for the chance to live authentically. Rather than the careful political maneuvering Rafael had expected, the gathering evolved into genuine community building as families discovered they weren't alone in their struggles. Meanwhile, children who'd never met others like themselves began forming friendships that transcended traditional social barriers. Next, Amélie organized activities that showcased different approaches to supernatural education and child rearing. From there, debates emerged about governance structures that honored individual autonomy while maintaining community stability. Soon after witnessing Omega scholars discussing policy with Alpha leaders as equals, Rafael felt his understanding of leadership expand beyond anything he'd previously imagined. Despite the risks involved, these conversations were producing insights that could benefit supernatural society if given the chance to develop. What followed was the kind of intellectual discourse that had been impossible under traditional hierarchies, where position mattered more than ideas. Still, the freedom to explore controversial topics would undoubtedly provide ammunition for enemies who preferred simple answers to complex questions. "This is what we're fighting for," Amélie said quietly, standing beside Rafael as they watched their children teach other young alphas how to control their abilities through games rather than dominance exercises. Not just our family, but the right for everyone to find the structure that helps them flourish. Yet her words carried weight that went beyond idealism to practical application. Even so, Rafael caught the underlying tension in her scent that suggested she was as aware as he was of the political stakes involved. "And if we fail?" Rafael asked, though he already knew her answer. Despite the magnitude of potential consequences, Amelie's response carried the same determination that had made her face down rogues to protect his children. The space between them filled with shared commitment as they watched their experiment in alternative community structure prove itself through lived experience rather than theoretical debate. Without another word, they committed to defending this sanctuary against whatever opposition their success would inevitably attract. Chapter 20: Shadows of Opposition. The attack came not with claws and fangs, but with whispered poison that spread through supernatural society like plague. Reading the inflammatory pamphlets that had appeared throughout the territory overnight, Rafael felt his wolf snarl with fury at enemies who fought with lies instead of honorable combat. Because the systematic character assassination targeting both him and Amélie represented warfare designed to destroy reputations rather than bodies. After analyzing the carefully crafted propaganda, the source became obvious despite attempts at anonymity. Next, his enhanced senses detected the scent of fear beneath council rhetoric. They were responding to success they hadn't anticipated with desperation disguised as righteous concern. From there, Rafael began cataloging specific accusations that revealed how closely they'd been observed during recent months. Soon after understanding the scope of surveillance they'd been under, his protective instincts demanded immediate action to shield his family from escalating political assault. What followed was his growing realization that their enemies had been documenting every private moment, twisting gestures of affection into evidence of impropriety. Still, the most damaging accusations targeted Amélie's influence over supernatural children, who weren't her biological offspring. Yet when he found his children reading the pamphlets with confusion that was rapidly turning to anger, Rafael knew the propaganda war had escalated beyond political maneuvering. Even so, Luna's empathic abilities were projecting hurt and fury that made every adult in the household want to track down whoever had written such poison. "Papa," Marcus said with a voice that carried a dangerous calm, "these people are lying about Amélie. They're saying she's dangerous, but she saved us from the rogues." Despite his son's obvious distress, Rafael caught something else in the boy's tone. The beginning of alpha dominance that would one day make Marcus a formidable leader. To make things worse, Luna's empathic projections were affecting every supernatural being within miles with righteous indignation. Not only were his children developing protective instincts toward their chosen family, But they were also learning that political warfare often targeted the innocent to achieve strategic goals. More importantly, their response would influence how other families viewed the cost of joining their community. Moments later, Amélie appeared with her own copy of the propaganda, her expression carrying steel that reminded Rafael why her noble bloodline had once been considered politically dangerous. By the time she finished reading, her scent carried determination that made his wolf pace with anticipation. Eventually, Rafael would understand that this attack represented exactly the kind of escalation their enemies needed to justify more direct intervention. That night, they would be forced to choose between defensive retreat and offensive counterattack. Come morning, the supernatural world would learn whether the Blackthorne family was strong enough to fight back against systematic destruction of their reputation. "They're trying to isolate us," Amélie said quietly, her strategic mind already processing the propaganda's true purpose. Rather than random character assassination, the accusations were specifically designed to make other families afraid of association with Moonhaven Estate. Meanwhile, Rafael felt his anger crystallize into something far more dangerous, the cold fury of an alpha whose pack had been threatened by cowards who hid behind lies. Next, he began planning responses that would either establish them as forces to be reckoned with or provide their enemies with justification for more direct action. From there, Amélie outlined countermeasures that would turn their opponents' tactics against them. Soon after explaining her approach, Rafael understood that she intended to use their enemies' lies as ammunition for exposing the fear-based thinking that drove opposition to social change. "We don't just defend ourselves," she continued, her gray eyes bright with strategic anticipation. "We expose the agenda behind these attacks and force our opponents to argue their positions publicly, rather than hiding behind anonymous accusations." What followed was the most sophisticated political campaign Rafael had ever witnessed, as Amélie began mobilizing resources he'd never suspected she possessed. Still, the risks of open confrontation with enemies who controlled significant political power would require careful calculation of potential consequences. "You want to draw them into the open," Rafael said, understanding her strategy with admiration that made his chest swell with pride. "Force them to defend positions that sound reasonable in private, but become obviously unjust when stated publicly." Yet the gleam in her eyes suggested she'd been planning this kind of systematic counteroffensive since the day she'd arrived at Moonhaven Estate. Even so, the political sophistication required for such maneuvering raised questions about her years in hiding that Rafael wasn't sure he was ready to explore. "Exactly," Amélie replied with a smile that carried both affection and anticipation. "If they want to fight us, they'll have to do it honestly instead of skulking in the shadows." Despite the danger inherent in such aggressive tactics, Rafael found himself looking forward to the battle ahead. The space between them crackled with shared determination as they prepared to defend not just their family, but every unconventional household that had dared to seek sanctuary at Moonhaven. Without another word, they began drafting responses that would either establish them as leaders worth following or mark them as threats requiring elimination. Chapter 21. The War of Words. The morning brought news that would change everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Standing in his study while urgent correspondence poured in from allies across the supernatural community, Rafael felt his understanding of the conflict shift from political maneuvering to something far more dangerous. Because the coordinated attacks on unconventional families throughout the territory suggested their opponents had moved beyond character assassination to direct action. After reading reports of homes burned and families threatened, the true scope of their enemy's campaign became terrifyingly clear. Next, his enhanced senses detected the approaching panic of servants who just received word that similar violence was spreading across multiple territories. From there, Rafael began connecting incidents that painted a picture of systematic persecution designed to eliminate anyone who dared follow the Blackthorne example. Soon after understanding that their success had triggered continent-wide retaliation, his protective instincts demanded immediate action to shield vulnerable families. What followed was his growing realization that they were no longer fighting for recognition, but for survival against enemies who preferred violence to legal challenges. Still, the children playing peacefully in the garden remained unaware that their sanctuary was about to become a fortress. Yet when Amélie appeared with her own intelligence that revealed the identity of their true opponent, Rafael felt his blood freeze with recognition. Even so, the implications of what she'd discovered would either destroy their movement or forge it into something unbreakable. "It's not just the council," Amélie said quietly, her voice carrying tension that made his wolf pace with aggressive anxiety. "Lord Thornton has been coordinating with the Purity Alliance." Despite having heard rumors about the extremist organization, Rafael hadn't believed they possessed the resources for such widespread operations. To make things worse, the Purity Alliance's ultimate goal was elimination of all supernatural beings who didn't conform to their vision of genetic perfection. Not only were they fighting political conservatives, but they were also facing genocidal fanatics who viewed unconventional families as contamination to be cleansed. More importantly, the Alliance's history included assassination campaigns that had eliminated entire bloodlines deemed unsuitable. Moments later, Marcus burst into the study with news that made Raphael's protective instincts explode into lethal fury. By the time his son finished explaining what he'd overheard from servants, the politics had become deeply personal. Eventually, Raphael would understand that this moment marked the transition from defensive maneuvering to offensive warfare. That night, he would be forced to choose between protecting his family through retreat or defending their community through violence. Come morning, the supernatural world would learn whether the alphas of Blackthorne was willing to kill for the revolution he'd started. "Papa," Marcus said with a voice that carried fear and anger in equal measure. "They're saying the Alliance is coming here. They want to hurt our friends and make Amélie go away forever." Rather than downplay the threat, Rafael knelt to meet his son's eyes with honesty that honored Marcus's developing alpha instincts. Meanwhile, Luna appeared in the doorway with tear-stained cheeks that broke his heart while strengthening his resolve. Next, Rafael spoke words that would define their family's approach to the crisis ahead. "Then we'll stop them. All of us. Together." From there, Amélie stepped forward with strategic documents that revealed preparation he'd never suspected. Soon after she began outlining defensive measures, Rafael understood that she'd been anticipating exactly this kind of escalation. "You've been planning for war," he said with admiration that made his chest swell with pride and terror. What followed was her confirmation that political revolution always faced violent opposition from those who profited from existing systems. Still, her readiness for such conflict raised questions about her past that Rafael wasn't sure he wanted answered. "The Alliance killed my parents," Amélie said simply, her gray eyes carrying pain that had been hidden beneath years of careful composure. "I've been preparing to fight them ever since." Yet instead of the revenge-driven motivation Rafael expected, her tone carried the cool determination of someone who understood that personal tragedy could fuel positive change. Even so, the revelation explained her combat skills and strategic thinking in ways that made their early encounters seem almost scripted. "Now you know why I really came to Moonhaven," she continued. "Not just to escape my past, but to build something the Alliance couldn't destroy." Despite the deception inherent in her admission, Rafael felt only gratitude for whatever circumstances had brought her to his family. Because without her influence, they would never have developed the strength necessary to face what was coming. The space between them burned with shared understanding as they prepared for a war that would either establish their vision of supernatural society or ensure its complete destruction. Without another word, they began mobilizing defenses that would protect everyone who dared to seek sanctuary at Moonhaven Estate. Chapter 22. Gathering the Storm. The allied families arrived like storm clouds gathering before lightning strikes. Watching carriages stream through Moonhaven's gates as word spread about the Alliance threat, Rafael felt his territory transform from peaceful sanctuary to military headquarters in the span of hours. Because every unconventional family that had attended their gatherings was now seeking protection against enemies who preferred elimination to coexistence. After the seventh family requested asylum, the true magnitude of their responsibility became overwhelming. Next, his enhanced senses detected the sense of fear and determination that created a complex tapestry of emotions throughout the estate grounds. From there, Rafael began organizing defenses that would protect not just his immediate family, but dozens of adults and children who'd committed themselves to their cause. Soon after understanding the tactical challenges involved, he felt his alpha nature respond to leadership demands that went far beyond territorial protection. What followed was perhaps the most complex military operation of Rafael's life, as he coordinated with allies who possessed different supernatural abilities and varying levels of combat experience. Still, the children who played in the gardens despite approaching danger reminded him why such protection was necessary. Yet when Dr. Voss approached with intelligence that changed everything, Rafael felt his strategic assessments shift toward scenarios he'd hoped never to face. Even so, the information she'd gathered would either save them all or ensure their destruction was swift rather than prolonged. The Alliance isn't just targeting families, Dr. Voss said with clinical precision that couldn't disguise her own terror. They're planning to eliminate every supernatural being who's ever supported integration with human society. Despite the scope of such ambitious genocide, Raphael's enhanced hearing detected the truth in her voice. To make things worse, the Alliance apparently possessed weapons specifically designed to counter supernatural advantages that had previously made such attacks impossible. Not only were they facing fanatics with genocidal intentions, but their enemies had also developed technology that neutralized the natural advantages that supernatural beings used for protection. More importantly, the Alliance's plans included systematic elimination of children to prevent future generations from carrying contaminated bloodlines. Moments later, Amélie appeared with maps that showed Alliance movements throughout the territory. By the time she finished explaining their enemies' deployment patterns, Raphael understood they were facing a coordinated assault designed to eliminate every family that had ever attended their gatherings. Eventually, he would recognize this as the moment their personal love story evolved into the foundation for species survival. That night, they would be forced to choose between defensive positions and offensive strikes that could prevent genocide. Come morning, the supernatural world would discover whether love was strong enough to motivate the kind of violence necessary to preserve their right to exist. Rather than panic at the overwhelming odds, Raphael felt something ancient and fierce awakening in his bloodline, the protective fury that had made his ancestors legendary among supernatural warriors. Meanwhile, other alpha leaders who'd arrived with their families began demonstrating why traditional hierarchies had developed around combat effectiveness. Next, Amélie began coordinating with Omega healers to establish medical facilities that could handle casualties from the kind of warfare they were preparing to face. From there, Beta organizers created supply chains that would sustain their community through extended siege conditions. Soon after witnessing supernatural cooperation on a scale that transcended traditional social barriers, Raphael understood that the Alliance's attack had accomplished something unexpected, uniting diverse communities against common threat. Despite the danger they faced, their enemies' extremism was forging bonds that might survive long after the immediate crisis passed. What followed was a strategy session that included every adult who'd sought sanctuary at Moonhaven Estate. Still, the most important voices belonged to those who'd survived previous Alliance attacks and understood the tactics they were likely to face. They used psychological warfare before physical assault, explained Marcus Darrow, an alpha whose pack had been decimated 2 years earlier. Try to break your spirit before they test your defenses. Yet, instead of the demoralization such tactics usually achieved, Raphael caught sense of determination and rage that suggested their enemies had finally pushed supernatural beings too far. Even so, channeling such emotions into effective resistance would require leadership that transcended individual grievances. Then we don't give them time for psychological manipulation, Raphael decided. We strike first, protect the children, and end this before they can implement their full plan. Despite gasps from some who'd hoped for purely defensive strategies, Rafael's tone carried the authority of someone who'd made the transition from protector to warrior. The space between them filled with acceptance, as everyone present understood that survival required embracing violence they'd hoped to avoid. Without another word, they began planning attacks that would either establish their right to exist or ensure their deaths served as warnings to others. Chapter 23. Blood and Choice. The attack came at dawn with silver bullets and screams that shattered the morning peace. Jolting awake to the sound of Alliance forces breaching Moonhaven's outer defenses, Rafael felt his wolf explode into protective fury that had been building since the first threats against his family. Because everything they'd fought to build was about to be tested by enemies who preferred death to change. After grabbing weapons that gleamed with supernatural enhancements, he rushed toward the sounds of battle while his enhanced senses cataloged the scope of the assault. Next, the sense of fear and rage from children who should never have witnessed such violence made his protective instincts demand immediate vengeance. From there, Rafael's tactical mind processed the enemy's deployment while his heart broke at Luna's terrified projections flooding the estate with empathic waves of pure terror. Soon after understanding that the Alliance had brought overwhelming force specifically to eliminate every person who'd sought sanctuary at Moonhaven, his fury crystallized into something lethal and precise. What followed was Rafael's complete transformation from political leader to apex predator, as he systematically began hunting enemies who dared threaten cubs under his protection. Still, the sounds of Amélie coordinating defensive positions reminded him that survival required strategy rather than simple rage. Yet when Marcus's scream cut through the battle noise, something inside Rafael shattered beyond any possibility of restraint. Even so, the direction of the cry told him his son was fighting rather than fleeing, alpha instincts asserting themselves despite his young age. "Papa!" Luna's voice carried empathic projections that painted a picture of Alliance soldiers specifically targeting children with weapons designed to cause maximum suffering. Despite every protective instinct demanding he go to his children immediately, Rafael forced himself to maintain tactical overview while trusting Amélie to coordinate their immediate defense. To make things worse, the Alliance's strategy appeared designed to force exactly such emotional reactions that would compromise defensive positions. Not only were they facing militarily superior forces, but their enemies understood supernatural psychology well enough to exploit parental bonds as tactical weaknesses. More importantly, the children's safety depended on adults maintaining discipline despite emotional pressure that would break most parents. Moments later, Dr. Voss's voice cut through the chaos with medical urgency that made Rafael's blood freeze. By the time she finished her desperate call for assistance, the cost of their revolution had become devastatingly personal. Eventually, Rafael would understand that this battle represented the ultimate test of everything Amélie had taught him about love requiring sacrifice. That night, he would be forced to choose between protecting his immediate family and defending the community they'd sworn to shelter. Come morning, the supernatural world would learn whether their love story was strong enough to survive the kind of losses that destroyed most families. Rather than abandon strategic positions for emotional response, Rafael began moving through the battle with lethal efficiency that reminded every Alliance soldier why alpha dominance had evolved from combat superiority. Meanwhile, his enhanced hearing tracked Amélie's voice coordinating Omega healers who were working under fire to save wounded allies. Next, he caught scents that told him some of their defenders were falling, while others were discovering combat abilities they'd never known they possessed. From there, the battle became a testament to what supernatural beings could accomplish when fighting for something more important than individual survival. Soon after eliminating 3 Alliance soldiers who'd been targeting children specifically, Rafael understood that their enemy's greatest mistake had been underestimating what love could motivate parents to become. Despite superior weapons and tactical preparation, the Alliance had failed to account for the fury of chosen families defending their right to exist. What followed was systematic destruction of enemy forces who'd expected to face disorganized resistance instead of coordinated supernatural warfare. Still, the cost in blood and terror would mark everyone who survived this day with memories that would influence their choices for generations. "Fall back to the main house." Amelie's voice carried tactical authority that cut through chaos while her Omega abilities worked to heal the wounded who could still be saved. Yet instead of retreat, her command established defensive positions that would force the Alliance to attack through killing zones where supernatural advantages could be maximized. Even so, Rafael caught undertones in her voice that suggested casualties among the children they'd sworn to protect. "How many?" Rafael called as he took position covering their withdrawal. Despite wanting reassurance, Rafael needed tactical information more than emotional comfort. The space between her words carried weight that would haunt them both regardless of whether they survived the next hour. Without another word, they committed to destroying every enemy who dared threaten their chosen family, no matter the cost to their own souls. Chapter 24. The Price of Victory. The silence after battle felt heavier than the violence that preceded it. Standing among bodies of Alliance soldiers who'd thought genocide was their right, Rafael surveyed the carnage while his wolf slowly retreated from the killing fury that had consumed him. Because the blood on his claws belonged to humans who'd chosen hatred over coexistence, and their deaths would echo through supernatural politics for generations. After confirming that no enemies remained alive to threaten his family, Rafael's attention fixed on the wounded allies who'd paid the price for defending their sanctuary. Next, his enhanced senses detected the complex mixture of grief and relief that filled the estate grounds where children were discovering what survival sometimes required. From there, his gaze moved to Amélie, who knelt beside Dr. Voss, while golden healing light flowed from her hands in a desperate attempt to save someone who'd risked everything for their cause. Soon after understanding the severity of injuries that even Omega magic might not be able to heal, Rafael felt victory turn bitter with the knowledge of what it had cost. What followed was perhaps the most difficult hour of Rafael's life as they counted the wounded and discovered which of their allies would never see another sunrise. Still, the children who clung to surviving adults with desperate relief reminded him why such sacrifice had been necessary. Yet when Marcus approached with blood on his clothes and horror in his young eyes, Rafael realized that some prices were paid by those too young to understand the full cost of what they'd witnessed. Even so, the steel in his son's voice suggested that today had accelerated his transition from child to warrior. "I killed one of them, Papa," Marcus said with a voice that carried trauma and pride in equal measure. He was going to hurt Luna. Despite wanting to shield his son from such realities, Rafael understood that war had already taken Marcus's innocence, regardless of any protection he might try to provide. To make things worse, Luna's empathic abilities were projecting the emotional aftermath of violence onto everyone within miles. Not only had their children been forced to participate in lethal combat, but they'd also been exposed to the kind of systematic hatred that would influence their understanding of supernatural society for the rest of their lives. More importantly, their responses to today's trauma would determine whether they became leaders who prevented such conflicts or warriors who perpetuated them. Moments later, Elder Ravencrest arrived with council reinforcements who'd apparently been monitoring the situation from a safe distance. By the time he began assessing the battlefield, Rafael understood that their victory would create political complications that might prove more dangerous than the Alliance itself. Eventually, Rafael would recognize this moment as the end of their innocence about the cost of revolution. That night, they would be forced to process trauma while planning for retaliation from enemies who viewed their success as unacceptable provocation. Come morning, the supernatural world would know that the Blackthorne family had proven their strength through blood, but at a price that would haunt them forever. Rather than celebration, Rafael felt only exhaustion as he watched surviving families reunite with children who'd been hidden during the worst of the fighting. Meanwhile, Amélie continued working to save lives that hung in the balance between Omega healing and injuries too severe for even magical intervention. Next, Elder Ravencrest approached with an expression that suggested political ramifications Rafael hadn't yet considered. From there, the conversation would determine whether their military victory translated into legal recognition or marked them as dangerous insurgents requiring elimination. "Alphas Blackthorne," Ravencrest said with formal gravity that carried both respect and warning. "You've proven that unconventional families can defend themselves effectively. The question now becomes whether supernatural society is ready for the changes such capability demands." Soon after understanding that their trial period had been accelerated by violence into immediate judgment, Rafael felt the weight of representing more than his individual household. Despite exhaustion and trauma, he needed to articulate a vision that would justify the blood that had been spilled. What followed was perhaps the most important speech of Rafael's life, as he explained to the most powerful supernatural leader why love-based communities deserved legal protection. Still, the bodies surrounding them provided context that made theoretical arguments feel inadequate. "We didn't choose this war," Rafael said quietly, his voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "But we'll finish it if forced to continue fighting for our right to exist." Yet his words contained more than threat. They carried the promise of what supernatural society could become if it chose evolution over tradition. "And if the Council continues to view our success as threat rather than opportunity?" Ravencrest asked with genuine curiosity. Despite the danger inherent in such honesty, Rafael met the elder's gaze with unflinching determination. The space between them filled with recognition that today had established precedents that would influence supernatural law for generations. Without another word, Rafael committed to defending their achievement regardless of what political consequences such defiance might bring. As the sun set over Moonhaven Estate, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson, one truth emerged from the carnage. Their love story had become legend written in blood and sacrifice. Chapter 25. Ashes and Renewal. 3 months after the battle, Moonhaven Estate bloomed with life that defied the violence it had witnessed. Walking through gardens where memorial stones marked fallen allies while children played among carefully tended flowers, Rafael felt the complex weight of rebuilding something beautiful from the ashes of necessary destruction. Because healing required acknowledging trauma while refusing to let it define their future. After identifying each carved name that represented lives lost defending their vision of supernatural society, Rafael's enhanced senses detected the mixture of grief and hope that permeated the estate grounds. Next, his attention moved to construction sites where new buildings would house families who'd chosen to settle permanently at their sanctuary. From there, Rafael observed the careful integration of security measures with domestic tranquility that marked their evolution from naive idealism to practical wisdom. Soon after understanding how thoroughly their community had changed since the Alliance attack, he felt pride tempered by the knowledge of what such strength had cost. What followed was his daily ritual of checking on children who'd witnessed horrors no young mind should carry. Still, their resilience continued to amaze him as they adapted to a world where love and violence sometimes walked hand in hand. Yet when he found Luna teaching younger children how to recognize danger while maintaining empathic openness, Rafael realized that trauma had accelerated her development in ways that were both inspiring and heartbreaking. Even so, her ability to transform pain into protective wisdom suggested strength that would serve future generations. "She's becoming quite the leader." Amelie's voice carried warmth tinged with concern as she joined him in observing their daughter's natural teaching abilities. Despite the pride in her tone, Rafael caught undertones that suggested she shared his worries about children growing up too fast. To make things worse, Marcus had begun displaying tactical awareness that spoke of alpha instincts shaped by premature exposure to warfare. Not only were their children developing capabilities beyond their years, but the entire community was evolving in response to challenges that had tested every assumption about peaceful coexistence. More importantly, their success was attracting attention from supernatural leaders who wanted to understand how love-based governance could survive such extreme opposition. Moments later, Elder Ravencrest approached with documents that would formalize recognition Raphael had never expected to receive. By the time he finished explaining the council's decision, the political landscape had shifted in ways that validated everything they'd fought to achieve. Eventually, Raphael would understand that their victory had catalyzed changes throughout supernatural society that went far beyond their individual circumstances. That night, he would celebrate achievements that had seemed impossible just a year ago. Come morning, the supernatural world would officially recognize that alternative family structures deserved legal protection and political representation. Rather than the grudging acknowledgement Raphael had anticipated, Elder Ravencrest's expression carried genuine respect that spoke of minds changed by observed evidence. Meanwhile, other families throughout the territory were implementing governance structures based on the Moonhaven model. Next, Ravencrest began outlining political reforms that would establish legal frameworks for unconventional households while maintaining stability that traditional leaders required. From there, the conversation evolved into collaborative planning for systematic change that honored both innovation and continuity. Soon after understanding the scope of transformation their struggle had initiated, Raphael felt the weight of responsibility for influencing supernatural society's evolution toward greater inclusivity. Despite the honor inherent in such recognition, he remained focused on protecting the community that had trusted him with their safety. The council has voted to establish the Moonhaven Accords, Ravencrest announced with formality that couldn't disguise his satisfaction. Legal recognition for family structures based on choice rather than biological imperative, with governance models that prioritize community welfare over hierarchical dominance. What followed was Raphael's growing understanding that their personal love story had become the foundation for legislative changes that would protect millions of supernatural beings who'd never fit traditional categories. Still, the political implications would require careful navigation to avoid triggering conservative backlash. And the opposition? Raphael asked, knowing that such radical change would inevitably face resistance. Yet Ravencrest's smile suggested that surviving the Alliance attack had provided unassailable proof of their model's viability. "Silenced by your success," the elder replied. "It's difficult to argue against effectiveness backed by such compelling evidence." Despite the satisfaction of political victory, Raphael found his attention drawn to more personal concerns. The space between him and Amélie filled with shared understanding as they processed how completely their world had transformed since that first morning when she'd arrived as maid number 12. Without another word, they walked toward the children who represented their most important achievement, a new generation raised to value love over power. Chapter 26. The New Foundation. The wedding ceremony took place in the garden where they'd first fought together against impossible odds. Standing beneath an arch of white roses that bloomed where memorial stones honored fallen friends, Raphael felt the profound rightness of binding his life to the woman who'd transformed everything he'd thought possible. Because their union represented more than personal happiness, it symbolized the triumph of choice over circumstance. After watching their children scatter flower petals with joy that had been earned through shared struggle, Raphael's attention fixed on Amélie as she approached wearing silk that gleamed like moonlight. Next, her radiant smile reminded him of the fearless maid who'd looked up at his window, without flinching on that first day. From there, Elder Ravencrest began the ceremony that would legally recognize what their hearts had known for months, that some bonds transcended social conventions to become fundamental truths. Soon after speaking vows that honored both their individual journeys and shared destination, Raphael felt his wolf settle into contentment that had seemed impossible during those dark months of isolation. What followed was perhaps the most perfect moment of Raphael's life, as community members who'd become family witnessed his commitment to the woman who'd saved them all. Still, the absent faces of those who'd died defending their vision added bittersweet depth to joy that might otherwise have felt too simple. Yet, when Marcus and Luna stepped forward to present rings they'd helped design, Rafael understood that this ceremony marked not just marriage, but the formal establishment of chosen family that would influence generations. Even so, the children's participation carried special significance that went beyond traditional roles. "Papa," Luna said with empathic projections that painted the ceremony in emotional colors visible to every supernatural being present, "we're really a family now, aren't we?" Despite the innocent phrasing, her question carried recognition that legal formalities had finally caught up with emotional realities they'd been living for months. To make things worse, Marcus's expression suggested he understood the political implications of this union for their community's future stability. Not only were they celebrating personal happiness, but they were also demonstrating that love-based families could achieve the kind of formal recognition that provided legal protection for vulnerable community members. More importantly, their success was inspiring similar ceremonies throughout supernatural society as other unconventional couples claimed their right to official acknowledgement. Moments later, Rafael spoke vows that would be remembered as the foundation for new traditions in supernatural marriage law. By the time he finished promising to honor Amélie as an equal partner rather than cherished possession, the politics became deeply personal. Eventually, Rafael would understand that this ceremony established precedents that would influence supernatural family law for centuries. That night, they would celebrate not just their union, but the community they'd built through love, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to protecting those who sought sanctuary. Come morning, they would wake as legally recognized partners in the ongoing revolution that was reshaping supernatural society around principles of choice rather than tradition. Rather than the formal recitation Rafael had expected, Amélie's vows carried the emotional honesty that had characterized every conversation since their first meeting. Meanwhile, her voice carried strength that reminded everyone present why she'd been able to face down enemies who'd thought Omega nature meant weakness. "Rafael," she said with clarity that cut through the ceremony to reach the truth, "you taught me that healing doesn't require hiding. That strength can be gentle. That love is worth fighting for even when the cost seems too high." Next, her attention moved to include Marcus and Luna in promises that transformed their household from nuclear family to intentional community. From there, she outlined a vision that encompassed not just their immediate happiness, but the ongoing responsibility to protect others who sought similar acceptance. Soon after understanding that her vows were essentially a political manifesto disguised as personal commitment, Rafael felt his admiration deepen for the woman who'd never separated individual happiness from community welfare. Despite the complexity of what she was promising, her tone carried certainty that made such ambitious goals seem achievable. What followed was Elder Ravencrest's official pronouncement that their union was recognized under both traditional supernatural law and the new Moonhaven Accords. Still, the most important recognition came from community members who'd chosen to build their lives around the family structure Rafael and Amélie had pioneered. "By the authority invested in me by the Supernatural Council and the witnessed consent of this community," Ravencrest declared, "I pronounce you partners in life, love, and the ongoing work of building a more inclusive society." Yet the ceremony's true power came not from official recognition, but from the shared commitment of everyone present to continue defending the principles they'd established through struggle. "You may kiss your bride," Ravencrest announced with a smile that suggested he understood the historical significance of this moment. Despite the formal language, Rafael felt only profound gratitude as he kissed the woman who'd saved not just his family, but his soul. The space between them filled with joy that had been purified by fire and strengthened by shared purpose. Without another word, they committed to building a future where love truly was the most powerful force in supernatural society. Chapter 27. Legacy of Love. 1 year later, the first Moonhaven Academy graduation ceremony drew supernatural families from across the continent. Standing before an audience that included political leaders who'd once viewed their community as a dangerous experiment, Rafael felt the weight of transformation that had rippled far beyond their personal circumstances. Because what had begun as an Omega maid, helping grieving children, had evolved into an educational revolution that was reshaping supernatural society. After watching Marcus deliver the student speaker address with confidence that honored both his Alpha heritage and Omega-influenced emotional intelligence, Rafael's pride swelled with recognition of how thoroughly their children had internalized lessons about leadership through service. Next, Luna demonstrated empathic abilities that had been trained to heal rather than manipulate, a skill set that was already attracting attention from diplomatic corps throughout supernatural territories. From there, Rafael observed other children whose families had sought sanctuary at Moonhaven, as they exhibited capabilities that transcended traditional supernatural categories. Soon after understanding that their educational model was producing the kind of innovative thinking that supernatural society desperately needed, he felt their personal healing transform into lasting institutional change. What followed was perhaps the most satisfying moment of Rafael's life as he watched former enemies applaud achievements that proved love-based governance could produce superior outcomes. Still, the absent faces of those who died defending this vision added depth to satisfaction that might otherwise have felt too simple. Yet when Dr. Voss announced the Academy's expansion plans that would establish similar institutions throughout supernatural territories, Rafael realized their influence was becoming self-sustaining. Even so, the responsibility for maintaining standards that honored their foundational principles would require constant vigilance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Voss said with authority that carried both medical precision and educational passion, "these graduates represent the first generation raised with full integration of supernatural abilities and emotional intelligence. They will lead us toward a future where difference is celebrated rather than feared." Despite the optimistic rhetoric, Rafael caught undertones that suggested ongoing challenges from conservative factions who preferred traditional hierarchies. To make things worse, their success was attracting attention from human governments who were beginning to question supernatural isolationism. Not only were they influencing supernatural society, but they were also creating pressure for broader integration that could expose their community to entirely new categories of opposition. More importantly, the children who'd grown up in their inclusive environment would eventually need to navigate a wider world that might not share their values. Moments later, Elder Ravencrest stepped forward with announcements that would establish the Moonhaven model as an official educational framework throughout supernatural territories. By the time he finished outlining implementation plans, Rafael understood that their personal victory had become an institutional revolution. Eventually, Rafael would recognize this ceremony as the moment their experimental community achieved permanent legitimacy. That night, they would celebrate achievements that had seemed impossible when Amélie first arrived as maid number 12. Come morning, supernatural society would officially embrace educational philosophy based on developing individual potential rather than enforcing categorical limitations. Rather than rest on achieving success, Amélie outlined expansion plans that would carry their principles to supernatural communities that were still struggling with traditional constraints. Meanwhile, her strategic mind was already processing challenges that would require continued innovation to overcome. Next, she began describing partnerships with human educational institutions that would facilitate integration while protecting supernatural security concerns. From there, the conversation evolved into planning for the kind of systematic change that would influence multiple generations. Soon after understanding the scope of transformation they were contemplating, Rafael felt the familiar mixture of excitement and trepidation that had characterized every major decision since Amélie's arrival. Despite the risks involved, their track record suggested that ambitious goals were achievable through careful planning and unwavering commitment. "We're not just changing supernatural education," Amélie said with a vision that encompassed possibilities Rafael was only beginning to imagine. "We're establishing the foundation for the kind of society our children will inherit, one where potential is limited only by imagination rather than arbitrary categories." What followed was Raphael's growing understanding that their love story had become the catalyst for species evolution toward greater cooperation and mutual understanding. Still, the magnitude of such responsibility sometimes felt overwhelming despite the support of their thriving community. "And if we fail?" Raphael asked, though he already knew her answer. Yet Amélie's response carried the same determination that had made her face down rogues to protect children who weren't biologically hers. "Then we fail while building something beautiful," she replied with a smile that held both tenderness and steel. "But we won't fail, not when we're fighting for love." The space between them filled with recognition that their personal happiness had become inseparable from the welfare of everyone who sought sanctuary in their expanding community. Without another word, they committed to continuing the revolution that had begun with a simple healing touch in a darkened chamber. Chapter 28. Forever. After 10 years after that first morning when Hope walked through Moonhaven's gates disguised as maid, Raphael stood watching his grandchildren play in gardens where memorial stones honored those who died for love. Observing Marcus teaching his own son the balance between alpha strength and omega compassion, while Luna guided her daughter through empathic exercises that would serve diplomatic rather than manipulative purposes, Raphael felt the profound satisfaction of watching principles become generational legacy, because what they'd built had survived every challenge to establish itself as a new tradition. After understanding that their experimental family structure had influenced supernatural society so thoroughly that alternative arrangements were now considered normal rather than revolutionary, Raphael's enhanced senses detected contentment that went beyond personal achievement. Next, his attention moved to Amélie, whose silver-streaked hair and lined face carried the beauty of wisdom earned through struggle. From there, he contemplated the journey that had transformed a broken widower and desperate Omega into partners who'd reshaped their world through simple commitment to loving without limitation. Soon after reviewing decades of challenges that had tested but never broken their bond, Raphael felt gratitude for every moment that had led to this peaceful afternoon. What followed was perhaps the most perfect silence of Raphael's life, as he absorbed the sounds of multiple generations who'd inherited the security to love freely, because two people had chosen courage over fear. Still, the ongoing responsibility for protecting such achievement required constant vigilance from community leaders who understood the cost of freedom. Yet, when their newest arrival, Marcus's infant daughter, opened eyes that held both alpha gold and omega gray, Raphael understood that nature itself was evolving to reflect the integration they'd fought to establish. Even so, each new child would need guidance to navigate a world where old prejudices still existed alongside new possibilities. "She's beautiful," Amélie said softly, settling beside Raphael on the garden bench where they'd made so many decisions that had influenced supernatural history. "And strong. I can already sense her potential." Despite the wonder in her voice, Raphael caught undertones that suggested she was already planning educational approaches that would help their granddaughter develop abilities that transcended traditional categories. To make things worse, their success had created expectations that each new generation would continue pushing boundaries that had once seemed unbreachable. Not only were they grandparents enjoying family happiness, but they were also guardians of revolutionary principles that required ongoing protection from forces that preferred simplicity to truth. More importantly, their legacy would be measured not just by personal achievements, but by their success in raising leaders who could continue evolving supernatural society. Moments later, Elder Ravencrest approached with documents that would establish the Moonhaven principles as fundamental law throughout supernatural territories. By the time he finished explaining the legislative process, Raphael understood that their experimental community had become the foundation for constitutional change. Eventually, Raphael would recognize this moment as the completion of transformation that had begun with a servant's healing touch in a darkened chamber. That night, he would celebrate the knowledge that love had indeed proven stronger than fear, law, and every obstacle their enemies had placed before them. Come morning, supernatural society would officially embrace governance philosophy based on protecting individual choice while maintaining community stability. The exact balance Rafael and Amélie had spent decades perfecting. Rather than a formal ceremony, Ravencrest's visit felt like conversation between old friends who'd witnessed impossible changes become inevitable progress. Meanwhile, children who'd never known a world where supernatural abilities determined social status played games that would have been unthinkable in Raphael's youth. Next, Amélie began describing plans for establishing Moonhaven-style communities on other continents, where supernatural beings still faced persecution for failing to conform to traditional expectations. From there, the conversation evolved into strategizing about how to share their model without imposing it on cultures that might need different approaches. Soon after understanding that their influence was spreading globally through voluntary adoption rather than political pressure, Raphael felt the deep satisfaction of watching revolution become evolution. Despite ongoing challenges, their success had created momentum that was transforming supernatural society toward greater inclusivity. "We did it," Raphael said quietly, his voice carrying wonder at the magnitude of what they'd accomplished through simple commitment to loving without reservation. What followed was Amélie's reminder that their work was never truly finished, that each generation would face new challenges requiring the same courage they'd demonstrated throughout their journey together. "We began it," she corrected gently. "Our children and grandchildren will continue it. That's how lasting change happens, through love that refuses to accept limitations." Yet her tone carried satisfaction that matched his own as they contemplated legacy that would influence supernatural society for generations. "Do you ever regret it?" Raphael asked, though he already knew her answer. "The scandal, the danger, the price we paid for choosing each other?" Despite everything they'd sacrificed and everyone they'd lost, Amélie's response carried the same certainty that had made her face down enemies who'd thought Omega nature meant weakness. "Never," she said simply. "Every moment of struggle was worth this, watching our children raise their own families in a world where love truly is the most powerful force." The space between them filled with peace that had been earned through fire and strengthened by shared purpose that transcended individual happiness. Without another word, they sat together watching their legacy play in gardens where memorial stones reminded everyone that some things were worth dying for, and even more worth living for. As the sun set over Moonhaven Estate, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, two hearts that had chosen love over law, courage over safety, and truth over tradition settled into the kind of contentment that came from knowing they'd spent their lives building something beautiful that would outlast them both. Their love story had become legend, but more importantly, it had become the foundation for a world where every supernatural being could hope for the same happiness they'd fought so hard to claim. And in the laughter of children who would never know the fear of hiding their true nature, Raphael and Amélie found the greatest victory of all. A future where love had indeed conquered everything.